today we are continuing our way through the story of the Bible. We are going to be going through this rapid pace, and we're still in Genesis though, right? We're spending a few weeks in Genesis, and then really as we start going through this story and as we get more acclimated to the biblical story and the worldview of Scripture, we're going to be able to go a little bit quicker. But we're spending a few weeks in Genesis just to get used to it. And the first week, we covered everything from creation all the way through basically the genealogy at the end of Genesis 5, right? So Genesis chapters 1 through 5. Last week, we covered even more material. We covered all the way from the flood in Genesis chapter 6 through the Abrahamic covenant in Genesis chapters 12, 15, and 17, right? So we got to talk about Noah, we got to talk about the Tower of Babel, and we got to be introduced to Abraham and his story. Today, we are going to continue Abraham's story. We are going to talk briefly about his son Isaac, and then we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about his son Jacob and basically the birth of these people of Israel, right? And so where we're picking up right now is immediately after Genesis 17. You go to Genesis 18, and there's been this lingering promise that God has made to Abraham that is yet to be fulfilled. What are the main things that promise is comprised of?
Land, seed, and blessing.
Yes, land, seed, and blessing, right? Those are the three words you really need to remember if you want to remember the Abrahamic covenant. Land, seed, blessing. God has promised that he is going to give Abraham's seed a bunch of land, right? But in order for his seed to receive land, Abraham has to have seed, right? And whenever God says he's going to have seed, he means that he is going to be the father of many nations, as we saw in Genesis 17, right? Prior to that, it was you're going to be the father of a great nation, but he messed up a little bit. He had a baby with Hagar, had Ishmael and stuff. So now he's going to be a father of many nations. His name was changed to Abraham. And in addition to being the father of many nations, we also know that there is going to be this one specific seed that comes from Abraham, and he will be a blessing to all the nations. Right? He will be the seed to crush the serpent that we read about way back in Genesis 3. Which then leads us to the third part, blessings. Right? God has promised that he is going to bless Abraham. He has promised Abraham that Abraham will be a blessing to the rest of the world. And through Abraham, a blessing will come to the world. Right? And so, land, seed, blessing, that is what God has promised him. And really the first thing we're waiting for is the seed. Right? Because Abraham doesn't really seem to have any reason to think that he is going to inherit the land that he's currently in. It's going to be his family that inherits that land. Right? And one thing that we've seen him wrestling with is the fact that despite the fact that God has made him all these promises, he has yet to have a single child through his wife Sarah. Right? Back in Genesis chapter 15, well, even at the very beginning of the story, it seems like Abraham might have thought that maybe his seed would pass through his nephew Lot, but then they ended up splitting apart. And then Genesis 15, he begins to wonder, well, God, maybe I'm going to choose my servant Eliezer of Damascus to be my heir. And God said, no, the seed is going to come from your own body. Well, then Abraham goes and sleeps with Hagar and has Ishmael, and God shows up and says, no, your seed is going to come from your wife Sarah. Right? And so that's where we're at going into Genesis 18. And what we're going to see in this story is we're going to see God very specifically articulate to Abraham how exactly that seed is going to come about. And so the way that our story opens up, and once again, I'm going to be summarizing a lot of this so that we're not, I'm going to try to read scripture here and there when we can, but I'm just going to try to summarize it for the sake of time. The way that Genesis 18 opens up is with Abraham, and he is camping at the oaks of a guy named Mamre. Right? So once again, Abraham does not own any land in the land of Canaan. He is simply dwelling there. And there's this guy named Mamre. Abraham is camping there. And in the distance, he sees three men walking towards him. Abraham gets up, he runs over, he bows down before the three men, and he invites them to come and eat dinner with him. Right? Or to share a meal, at least. And so the three men come, and very quickly it becomes evident that these three men are more than just men. As the story unfolds, we're going to realize that two of them are messengers of the Lord, right? They're angels. That's how we would usually translate it. While the third one is the messenger of the Lord, the angel of the Lord, who seems to be Yahweh himself, right? That's who these three guys are. And so they come and they have a meal with Abraham. And Abraham is sitting there. He is entertaining them while Sarah is in the tent doing her own thing and helping, serve them. Well, as the conversation ensues, the three men reveal to Abraham that they know about his future. And they tell Abraham that in 1 year's time, they are going to return and Sarah will be pregnant and she will have a child. Well, it's at this moment that Sarah lets out a laugh, right? And this laugh seems to not be audible to anybody except for God himself. And God says, Abraham, why is it that your wife laughed whenever I said that she would have a child? And at this point, Sarah comes out from the tent and says, I didn't laugh. And Yahweh says, oh, no, you did laugh. And in my opinion, it's probably one of the single most awkward moments in the entire Bible. Because the story could just move on, but then Yahweh takes his time to say, no, you did laugh. In Hebrew, the word for laughter is yitzhak, from which we get the name Isaac. Well, the child's name is going to be Isaac in response to this whole moment, right? Abraham also laughed in response to God's announcement, but Abraham seemed to be laughing in delight and in faith, right? He was like, really? Whereas Sarah seemed to be laughing in disbelief. Right? And so Sarah, she doesn't really seem to be on track with this whole thing because she's like, I'm old, right? She's 89 years old at this point. And she's like, an 89-year-old's going to have a kid? Really? But God says, is anything too powerful for me? Is any word too hard for the Lord? Of course. Yes, I am going to give you this child. And so that's how that story really goes down. At the end of this meal, Abraham, being a good host, he gets up and he begins to walk his... He begins to walk his visitors away, right? And they begin making their way towards the Dead Sea area where they come to this overlook where they can look across the Dead Sea and in the distance are the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. And that's where this interaction right here goes down. Yahweh is walking with the two messengers, right? The three men walking all together. And Yahweh turns to them and he says this, shall I conceal from Abraham what I am about to do? Since Abraham will surely become a great and mighty nation, and in him all the nations of the earth will be blessed. For I have known him, so that he may command his children and his household after him, that they keep the way of Yahweh to do righteousness and justice, so that Yahweh may bring upon Abraham what he has spoken about him. There's a few things that are very interesting about this account right here. Right? Those verses right there are the very first time where God explicitly says why he picked Abraham at all. Right? Because if you've just been reading the story, that might have been a lingering question. Right? I mean, literally, the way that the story starts off in Genesis 12 is that God, out of nowhere, shows up to Abraham and makes all these promises to him. And we've kind of talked about it last week. We kind of talked about what God's logic seems to be behind all this. Right? Because we talked about, as a result of the Tower of Babel, you've got all these nations that are set apart, and they're all different from one another. And really, the big problem is, how is God going to drive the nations back to him now that they're all different cultures and they speak different languages and stuff? And so just reading through the story of Genesis, we kind of logically came to this conclusion that God was going to do something through Abraham that would accomplish his end goal. Well, right here in chapter 18, God explicitly clarifies why he picked Abraham. And he says it right there, that they keep the way of Yahweh to do righteousness and justice. Right? The reason he picked Abraham is that Abraham and his seed are called to be guardians of the way, right? In Hebrew, the word for way is derek, right? Whenever you go to the book, the Gospel of John, Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Whenever the early church was born, they called themselves followers of the way. This is what it's all calling back to, right? Right here, we have Abraham identified as a guardian of the way, a protector of the way. His whole job, the reason why God picked him and made all these promises to him, was so that Abraham and his seed would be the ones who showed people how to get back to God. Right? So the problem that began way back in Genesis, where man chose sin and humans were separated from God, well, that needs to be fixed somehow. And Abraham's family are going to be the ones who teach people that way. Right? They're protectors of the way, the keepers of the way, the guardians of the way. The word for keep there is the same word that you see in Hebrew. It's the same word for the seraphim who was placed outside the Garden of Eden. It says that he was keeping watch to keep the entrance clear, right? It's protecting, right? That's what we're called to do. That's what Abraham is called to do, right? He is supposed to be the light shining in the darkness, showing people the way back to God. And there's two ways that God specifies that they're going to do this, right? They're going to keep the way of Yahweh by doing righteousness and doing justice. AKA, they're going to keep and protect God's definition of righteousness, AKA what God deems to be right, and they're going to maintain and keep God's sense of justice, AKA what God deems to be just. Right? Those are the ways that you protect the way of Yahweh. They demonstrate what true righteousness is and what true justice is. Right? All the other nations will have different definitions of righteousness and justice. Right? Abraham and his seed, the people of Israel, they are going to be the ones who uphold true righteousness and true justice so that the world can look to them and understand how to get back to God. Does that make sense?
Yes.
All right. So that's the first time we actually get to learn why God picked Abraham. But this is revealed in the midst of a question. Right? God is turning to the two messengers as they're overlooking Sodom and Gomorrah. And he says, shall I conceal from Abraham what I'm about to do, since Abraham will become a great and mighty nation, yada, yada, yada. Right? So God is turning to the messengers and he says, okay, if I have picked Abraham for this purpose, shouldn't I reveal to him extra insight to what I'm doing? Right? So we're learning a little bit more about God's relationship to Abraham here. Right? Because Abraham and his seed are protectors of the way of Yahweh, they are going to inherently receive more revelation and insight from God. Right? This is something that the Apostle Paul will talk about in the book of Romans. Right? What benefit is there to being an Israelite? Well, they're the ones who received the oracles of God. Right? The prophets were sent to the Israelites and not to the other nations as much. Right? The Israelites are going to be the ones that God reveals his plans to. But in this particular moment, what God's going to do is he's going to test Abraham. Right? As they're overlooking Sodom and Gomorrah, God has certain plans that he is going to do towards Sodom and Gomorrah, and he wants to see whether or not Abraham understands his righteousness and his justice. And so he turns to the messengers and says, shouldn't I reveal this to Abraham? And so this is the resulting conversation that happens. Let's see. Let's pick up verse 20. And Yahweh said, the outcry of Sodom and Gomorrah is indeed great, and their sin is exceedingly grave. I will go down now and see if they have done entirely according to its outcry, which has come to me, and if not, I will know. Right? So God explains that what he's going to do is he is going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah because of how evil their sin has become. Right? It kind of brings back to mind what we saw with the flood. Right? If you go back to Genesis chapter 6 through 8, God is grieved by sin and he destroys something. Well, God's promised he's not going to flood the entire earth again or anything, right? But that doesn't mean that he is not going to enact justice, right? And he still has a measure of righteousness and justice to uphold. And so he says, I'm going to reveal this to Abraham and see what Abraham has to think about it. And so Yahweh sends the two messengers off and they begin to walk into Sodom and Gomorrah. We're going to pick up with them in a little bit. What God does is he turns and he begins to speak with Abraham. Pretty cool moment, right? If you just think about the nature of this relationship, the fact that Abraham and God can just be standing there together talking to one another. I don't think we should be surprised whenever later in the Bible it describes Abraham as a friend of God. So, Yahweh explains to Abraham what he's going to do, and this is what Abraham says in verse 23. Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Suppose there are 50 righteous within the city. Will you indeed sweep it away and not spare the place for the sake of the 50 righteous who are in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to slay the righteous with the wicked, so that the righteous and the wicked are treated alike. Far be it from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth deal justly? If you notice, there's two words that Abraham emphasizes there. Righteous and just. Well, if you read the previous verses, what did God say that it was Abraham's job to do? He is supposed to keep the way of Yahweh to do righteousness and justice. Right? And so he says, Abraham, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to wipe out Sodom and Gomorrah. And his whole thing is he's wanting to test whether or not Abraham understands his righteousness and his justice, whether or not Abraham is actually equipped to keep the way. Right? Is Abraham a good protector? Or is he just going to, be a yes man? Is he just going to say, you know what, God, you do that? Right. Can somebody unlock the door? Okay. So is Abraham just going to be a yes man who says, okay, God, yeah, whatever you want to do? Or is he going to say, God, that's not your character? Well, Abraham responds, and he says, hello, Maverick. That's not what Abraham says. I said, hello, Maverick. Abraham responds, and he says, God, are you really going to wipe away the righteous with the wicked? Right? He says, God, that doesn't seem like your character. There's got to be some righteous people in there. You need to do what's just. And we get the impression that Abraham does understand God's righteousness and his justice. And so a discourse begins to develop. This is what happens. So the Lord said, if I find in Sodom 50 righteous within the city, then I will spare the whole place on their account. And Abraham replied, now behold, I have ventured to speak to Yahweh, although I am but dust and ashes. Suppose the 50 righteous are lacking 5. Will you destroy the whole city because of 5? And he said, I will not destroy it if I find 45 in there. He spoke to him yet again and said, suppose 40 are found there. And he said, I will not do it on account of the 40. Then he said, oh, may the Lord not be angry, then I shall speak. Suppose there are 30 found there. And he said, I will not do it if I find 30 there. And he said, now behold, I have ventured to speak to the Lord. Suppose 20 are found there. And he said, I will not destroy it on account of 20. Then he said, oh, may the Lord not be angry, but I shall speak only this once. Suppose 10 are found there. And he said, I will not destroy it on account of the 10. As soon as he had finished speaking to Abraham, Yahweh departed, and Abraham returned to this place. So here we see that Abraham passes the test, right? What happens is that Abraham looks at God and says, God, I understand that Sodom is sinful, and I understand that they're horrible, but you're a gracious God, and your standard of righteousness is not to kill innocent people, right? What if there's 50 righteous people there? They don't deserve to die. And God says, okay, you're right. I don't deal unrighteously. I won't destroy them for 50. What if there's 45? I won't destroy it for 45. What if there's 40? What if there's 30? What if there's 20? What if there's 10? What we see here is that not only does Abraham understand God's sense of righteousness and justice, Abraham understands God's graciousness. He understands God's hesed, his mercy, right? He understands that God is only going to give judgment when judgment is absolutely deserved, right? And so he voices that. He says, God, if there were 10 righteous people in there, wouldn't you spare Sodom? And keep in mind, there's probably thousands of people living in Sodom. And he says, just for 10, right? You'd spare the whole place, right? Notice that he's not simply saying, spare the 10. He's saying, for 10 righteous, wouldn't you spare all of Sodom, right? It's like that's God's graciousness, right? For the sake of 10, he would spare the whole place. And God says, absolutely. But Abraham also knows that even graciousness has its ending point. Mm-hmm. And so he emphasizes the grace of God. 50, 45, 40, 30, 20, 10. But even then he recognizes, okay, if there's less than 10, then Sodom needs to go up in ashes. Right? And so Abraham stops debating. He stops arguing. Because Abraham knows God's righteousness and justice. He knows that God is so righteous and so pure that he will not wipe out the righteous with the wicked. And in fact, not only will he not wipe out the righteous with the wicked, but he'll actually spare the wicked for the sake of the righteous. But he also knows that God is just. And he knows that sin needs to be punished. And so Abraham knows when to speak and he knows when to be quiet, aka Abraham knows exactly what he needs to do. Right? He needs to be a keeper of the way of Yahweh, and he is doing it in passing with flying colors. And so Abraham departs, and Yahweh goes his own way. And we pick back up in Genesis 19 with the 2 messengers working their way into Sodom and Gomorrah. And I think this is absolutely fascinating because we get to learn a little bit of how Yahweh works. Right? Because I'll remind you that the messengers were sent away from Yahweh before this conversation unfolded. Right? So Yahweh already set this motion and plan before he even talked with Abraham, because Yahweh knew how this conversation was going to end. Because Yahweh knew there were not 10 righteous people in the city. And so he's not going to spare the whole city, but there are a few righteous people in there. And so he will take those righteous people out. But he's not even doing it for the sake of them. He's doing it more for the sake of Abraham, because as we're going to see, these people barely fit the definition of righteous. The only reason they fit the definition of righteous is because they follow Yahweh. Right? It's not because they are actually living righteously. Right? It's because their faith is in God, not because they actually are living righteous lives. And so Genesis 19, we pick up and we get to see the messengers arrive in Sodom. And very quickly we get to see that Sodom is not a great place. Right? They go to the basically the town square. And this is typically where people would go if they were just needing shelter of some sort. Right? It's just like a common place to go. And then usually what they would expect is that some local person would come and find them and give them shelter. But nobody comes until eventually, lo and behold, Abraham's nephew Lot, who lives in Sodom, Well, he comes by, and he sees the guys, and he says, guys, y'all need to come stay with me. And they say, oh, we don't want to trouble you. And Lot says, no, you need to stay with me. Please come. The implication is that he's aware that it is not going to be safe for them if they stay out in the town square. And so the men come with him, and they have a meal and everything like that. And then, as the night progresses, a knock comes on the door, right? A bunch of knocks. And all of a sudden, the men of Sodom are gathered outside the city, and they are saying, bring those two men out here so that we may get to know them, right? And the Hebrew word for know here, it implies much more than simply greeting, right? If you remember back in Genesis chapter 4, it said Adam knew his wife Eve, and they had a child named Cain, right? So whenever it says know here, it's talking about having sexual intercourse, right? So basically, just to put this very bluntly, what the men of Sodom are suggesting is what we would call homosexual gang rape, right? That's what this is, right? No other way to put it. And add to that also the sin of inhospitality, which is also bad, right? So they're saying, throw the men out here so that we can assault them. And Lot, being the good host that he is, comes out there and he says, no, men of Sodom, you shall not do this vile act, right? And we get to see that that Lot is standing up to these men. And if Lot stopped there, he might be a little praiseworthy. But he doesn't stop there, because we see that Lot, from living in Sodom, has also been kind of corrupted. And he says, don't take these two men, take my two virgin daughters instead. It's like, okay, well, that's a problem, right? I mean, he's being a good host, but he's not being a good dad. He probably should have just said no. But it seems like Lot also knows how bad these guys are, and he realizes that they're not going to be satiated with nothing, right? But it just so happens that these messengers from the Lord have supernatural powers, right? And so they drag Lot back inside, and they basically strike the men blind outside and basically send them into confusion so that they handle that problem. And the two messengers explain to Lot what the situation actually is. They say, Lot, we have been sent here to get you and your family out because God is about to send this city up in flames. We do not have time to waste. Get your stuff, get your family, let's go. And Lot doesn't really respond how you would expect him to, right? To be fair, it probably sounds like one of those, people walking down the streets with a cardboard sign saying, the end is nigh. Like, it probably sounds pretty crazy to him, right? The idea of this city that he's dwelt in for decades now, the idea of that city just going up in flames, I mean, cities don't just do that, right? And so it sounds ridiculous to him, but eventually they do convince him that this is true. And I'm condensing the whole story down, but eventually him and his family, they start making their way out, right? And they start making their way, and this whole time, Lot is kind of trying to bargain with the messengers. Once again, it's the idea that he doesn't seem to take it as seriously as he should. But eventually, they do convince him to leave. And so Lot, his two daughters, and his wife begin to leave. They warned them not to look back. Lot's wife looks back. And she looks back as the city is going up in flames, and she is turned into a pillar of salt. Part of me always... I never really knew how to interpret this passage in the past, because I used to think that maybe this was just a metaphor for her getting caught up in the destruction or something like that. But whenever you actually look at first century sources such as Josephus, he actually recounts that apparently there was a pillar of salt identified as like the wife of Lot, and that you could still visit it during the first century, which is interesting to me. I don't know what to do with that information, but apparently it seems to be quite literal that she was miraculously turned into a pillar of salt. And once again, there's up for debate about exactly what that means. But Lot's wife dies, right? And Lot and his two daughters just barely escape the city as it goes up in flames, and God rains down hellfire and brimstone onto the city. Lot and his two daughters, they escape into the mountains. And the very end of Genesis 19 gives us one of the strangest and most disturbing stories that we get in all of Genesis. I wish that I could say one of the strangest and most disturbing stories in the entire Bible, but unfortunately it does not even get close to that. But in Genesis, it's a pretty wild story. Lot and his daughters have escaped into a cave up in the mountains, and the Bible doesn't go out of its way to explain their mindset behind this, but the only way that I can justify their actions is I am assuming that these people think that they are the last people alive on earth, right? And let me kind of justify exactly why I'm thinking that, and then I'll tell you what story actually happens here. Do you remember why it was that Lot chose to live in Sodom? Yeah, it was fertile, right? He looked at it, and he looked at the land, and he thought it was like Eden, right? He looked at it, and he said, that place looks like paradise. I want to live there. Well, if you go down to where Sodom and Gomorrah is now, it looks like desert region, right? It is desert region, right? The sea is literally called the Dead Sea because of the salt deposits. And so let me just suggest this to you, right? Lot and his family have lived in Sodom, which was like the Garden of Eden, for decades now. Lot's daughters grew up there, right? It tells us that they were virgins at the time, which means that they were probably young teenagers whenever this whole story happened, which tells me that they had been born when they were in Sodom, right? They grew up this entire time, and the only life they had ever known was living in this Eden-like place. Mm-hmm. They escape it, and whenever they wake up in the morning, this Eden-like place has been burnt to a crisp and turned into a desert wasteland. It's like you're watching like a post-apocalyptic movie, right? Everybody they know and love is dead, right? Everybody they've ever cared for is dead. I am assuming that these girls believe that they are the last people on earth. And so the two daughters do what we would consider unthinkable. And I don't think that the Bible wants us to approve of what they're doing. I'm just trying to kind of justify it from their perspective. They decide that they need to repopulate. And so what they do is they decide to get their father drunk and sleep with their father. And one girl does it one night, the other girl does it the other night, and eventually they get pregnant. And the result of this incestuous union are the cultures and the people groups of Ammon and Moab. Right? If you were to look at a map of Israel, if you go to the eastern side of the Dead Sea, you see the lands of Ammon, which is directly to the east, and then the land of Moab, which is to like the southeast, right? And that's because that is where they were born, right? If you look at where Sodom and Gomorrah was at, that was like the southeast area of the Dead Sea. Well, Lot and his daughters, they produced those babies in that region, right? And so the main reason that story seems to be there is to just tell us a little bit more about where these people groups came from that the Israelites are going to be dealing with for the rest of their story, right? And so that's a really sad story. Right? Whenever you read chapters 18 and 19, it's another pretty bizarre story in the grand scheme of things. But on one hand, in chapter 18, we get to see what Abraham's whole role is, and we get to see that Abraham is supposed to be a guardian of the way of Yahweh. Right? And we see that he's pretty good at that. Chapter 19 lets us see what God is willing to do for Abraham. Right? Because he went and he saved Abraham's nephew Lot from destruction, even though Lot seems to have been just as unrighteous as the rest of the people in Sodom. The only thing that really seems to set Lot apart is that he seems to, at least, have worshipped Yahweh. But we don't even learn that really in chapter 19 of Genesis. The author of Hebrews in the New Testament tells us that, right? And so the author of Hebrews actually calls Lot righteous. But it seems like the main reason Lot is saved is for Abraham's sake more than anything else, right? We go into Genesis chapter 20, and this is where we get to see Abraham make a big boo-boo all over again. If you remember back in Genesis chapter 12, Abraham went down to Egypt and he lied concerning his wife, saying that his wife was actually his sister. Y'all remember that? Well, Abraham does the same thing again, except now he's not doing it in Egypt. He's doing it to a guy named Abimelech. And the main reason that this story seems to be shared is because it's showing that Abraham, though he has grown in some ways, he has not grown in others. And what he does here this time really is actually even worse. Because if you think about it, I mean, now Abraham at least knows a timeline of when his child is supposed to be born, right? In Genesis 18, the messenger showed up and said that in 1 year's time, your wife is going to have this baby. And now here we are in Genesis chapter 20, and Abraham does the same thing where he gives his wife away to another man. You see how that's even more problematic? Now he at least has a timeline. He has waited 24 years for this. And now he knows he has less than 1 year to wait. And I'm assuming this happens during a 3-month time span, right? Because we know that eventually he's going to get Sarah back and everything like that, right? So within 3 months of receiving this news, Abraham messes up again. He gives his wife away to Abimelech, and it's only by the grace of God that his lie is revealed, and Abimelech gives his wife back. In addition to that, Abimelech gives all this stuff to Abraham and tells him to get out, right? And so we see once again that Abraham is not perfect. But if you go back to Genesis chapter 15, remember, Abraham was considered righteous by God, right? So once again, we realize that righteousness isn't the same as living righteously, right? Righteousness comes through faith, and even those who are viewed as righteous by God are going to mess up, right? And so that's something that's being established very early on in the book of Genesis. Abraham is righteous by faith, but that doesn't mean he always does the righteous thing, right? The main thing is keeping your eyes on Yahweh. If you're faithful to Yahweh, then you are righteous. And if you place your hope in the promised seed to come from Abraham, you're good to go. However, that doesn't mean you're always going to be perfect. You get to Genesis chapter 21, and lo and behold, Isaac is born. And we get to see Abraham finally have his child. And that's really the highlight of Genesis chapter 21. Right? You get to see this, Genesis 21, verse 1. Then Yahweh took note of Sarah as he had said, and Yahweh did for Sarah as he had promised. So Sarah conceived and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the appointed time of which God had spoken to him. Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore to him, Isaac. Then Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Now Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. And she said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son at this old age. And so we get to see that once again, Sarah is laughing. And so there's really several reasons why Isaac is named laughter, right? It's first off because Abraham laughed in faith. It's secondly because Sarah originally laughed in disbelief. And now that Sarah has actually had this child at 90 years of age while Abraham is 100, Sarah laughs in delight, right? And she laughs because she actually gets to see her hope fulfilled. And so this moment right here, you really don't, you can't overstate the significance of this moment. Because with the birth of Isaac, we have the Abrahamic covenant confirmed. And if you remember, the Abrahamic covenant is an unconditional covenant that lasts until eternity. And we've really been waiting for this moment right here, right? Because it's one thing for Abraham to go and have a child with Hagar, right? Because Hagar is just a young woman, and it makes sense for him to go, because men can basically have children at almost any time in their life, right? I mean, it gets harder once you get older, but by and large, they can have kids until they die if they want, right? Women are the ones where there's kind of a limit on how long they can have kids, right? So Abraham having a child with Hagar doesn't really say anything significant. However, Abraham having a child with Sarah, well, Sarah's 90 years old. This confirms that this was a miraculous act, right? And so Abraham doesn't need to have 300 kids. He does not need to see his family become a great nation in order for the covenant to be confirmed. He just has to have one child. And with having that one child, it is confirmed to him that God will be faithful to his promise. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And so, Abraham has Isaac. Whenever you read the rest of chapter 21, there is some extra drama, once again, coming up in between like Ishmael and Isaac and stuff like that. We don't need to get into that. I would encourage you to go read the story for yourself. But what I want to do is I actually want to jump forward to Genesis chapter 22. Because in Genesis chapter 22, what we're going to see is we're going to see Abraham's big final test. But before we do that, I want to recap something. How is it that Abraham and his seed are set apart? Right? This is something that hopefully we've been picking up on as we've been reading through this. But I figure that it's at this point that it's good to recap exactly how it is that Abraham is set apart from everybody else. Right? And these are things that we pick up on really just throughout the chapters, right? But I think it's worth highlighting just because it's good to keep this in mind as we read through the rest of the story of Scripture. The first way is that they are the recipients of special revelation, unique disclosure to God's divine purpose, right? This is what I talked about a few minutes ago whenever we were talking about Genesis 18, right? Shall I not reveal this to Abraham because I have chosen him to keep the way of Yahweh? Well, Abraham and his seed, they're going to be set apart because they receive special revelation in ways that other people do not. Right? The people of China do not receive as much special revelation as the people of Israel do. Right? The people in America, we do not receive the same special revelation that the children of Abraham did. Right? The oracles of God were revealed to the sons of Abraham, to the sons of Israel. Secondly, they were esteemed in dignity in the eyes of God and man. Right? God miraculously made them great. Right? I mean, if you think about it, even to this day, the sons of Abraham are making the news everywhere. Right? Israel is just this tiny little piece of land, yet it is on international news every single day. Right? You can't say that for like Rhode Island. Right? But that's true of Israel. Thirdly, they are the bearers of the blessed seed through whom all nations will be blessed. Right? That's another benefit that Abraham has. Right? The family line, like Jesus, he's not going to be descended from the people of China. He's not going to be descended from Americans. He came from Abraham, from Isaac, from Jacob. Fourthly, by having a unique relationship with God being known by him. Right? The cool thing that we're going to see is that every nation, like if we place our faith in the God of Israel, then we can be saved. Right? I mean, like, none of us in this room are Jewish, right? None of us are Israelites. But we still believe in the God of Israel. But Israel and Abraham, they have a special relationship with God because he is called the God of Abraham, the God of Israel. Right? That's a unique relationship. We don't have that. Right? We do have a unique relationship with him in another sense, but we can't claim to have it in the same way. Right? He is the God of Abraham, of Isaac, of Jacob. Fifthly, they have a unique duty by God as guardians of the way of Yahweh. Right? In this way, this job actually kind of transfers over to us as Christians. Right? Because we are followers of the way. Basically, the more and more narrow, the more evident that way becomes, the stricter, this duty, the smaller the group of people this duty is going to be handed over to. Because as we're going to see, as the history progresses, many people of Israel are going to turn astray, and they're not going to protect the way. But God is always going to save a remnant to do that. Right? And there's always going to be a small remnant in Israel who does preserve the way of Yahweh, and that is their special duty. That is their prescribed duty by God. Sixthly, by having a unique responsibility from God to preserve righteousness and justice. Right? This is the way that they protect the way. Right? Their duty is to protect the way of Yahweh, and the way they do that is by being responsible to preserve his definition of righteousness and justice. Seventhly, they have a unique hope in God, actively awaiting the fulfillment of his promises. The only reason we know what to place our faith in, and the only way we know what our hope is in, is because we have the Jewish scriptures. Right? We would not know these things if it was not for what God had revealed to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, to the prophets. Right? That's the only reason we have access to it. Right? And so, the seed of Abraham, they had the unique hope in God. And this is what Paul talks about in the book of Ephesians. Right? Gentiles, we were separated. Right? We were separated from the commonwealth of Israel. We had no hope in the world. Right? Because we were simply searching for meaning, searching for God. But God came and revealed himself to the sons of Abraham. Right? And so these are all ways where Abraham and his seed are set apart in Scripture. And we need to realize that these are all things that we need to have in mind as we read through the story of the Bible. Does that make sense?
Yes.
That being said, let's go and let's look at Genesis chapter 22, where we are going to see Abraham's final test. This is what we read in Genesis chapter 22, verses 1 through 3. Now it came about after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham! And he said, Here I am. He said, Take now your son, your only son whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I will tell you. So one thing that I want to highlight right here is I want to highlight the fact that this last test is very reflective of the first test that God gave Abraham. Right? If you go back to Genesis chapter 12, remember what God said. Go forth from your land and from your kin and from your father's house. Right? And remember how it got more and more specific? Right? Land, kin, father's house. Well, look at this. Take now your son, your only one, whom you love, Isaac. Right? He says, take your son. Well, Abraham has two sons. Right? He's got Ishmael and Isaac. But he says, your only one. Right? It's talking about only begotten. Right? Like the one from your wife. Right? Okay, well now it gets more specific. The one whom you love. This is actually the very first time the word love shows up in the entire Bible. I find it interesting that the word love shows up for the very first time in a context where somebody is being asked to give up the thing they love most dearly for the sake of God. Right? So he says, take your son whom you love. I think it's also really cool that the Bible waits to use the word love here. Right? Because we love the word love. Right? And so the word love shows up in this moment right here. And I think that's supposed to punctuate the emotional baggage that this command comes with. Right? This is the first time we see the word love. and God's going to tell him to give up what he loves. Right? The idea is that Isaac is the most precious thing in the world to Abraham, which makes sense. He waited 25 years for this one child to be born, and now he's going to be asked to give the child up. Take now your son, your only one whom you love, Isaac. And then if you go back to Genesis 12, remember he said, to the land which I will show you. Well, this time he's even more specific. Go forth to the land of Moriah, and he's going to say, to the mountain which I show you. Right? So he says, you're going to go to the land of Moriah and go to the mountain that I show you there. Right? But it's the same thing. Go to the land I show you. Go forth to the land of Moriah, to the mountain which I will tell you. And now this is where there's a deviation. Do you remember all the things that God promised Abraham in return in Genesis 12? I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great. You shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. Right? So he said, Abraham, I want you to leave everything, and as a result, you're going to gain everything. Right? So he said, I need you to place your faith in me, and it will be worth it. We don't have anything like that in Genesis 22. He says, go forth from the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I will tell you. So in Genesis 12, he said, get up, leave everything, and if you do it, I'm going to give you all this stuff in return. Well, right here, he says, get up, leave everything, and give up the one thing that I already gave you. Do you see how he's asking him to get, this is a lot harder, right? I mean, Genesis 12 was already difficult, but now this is even worse. But then notice that both times Abraham walks in perfect obedience. Genesis 12, so Abraham went forth as Yahweh had spoken to him. Genesis 22, so Abraham rose early in the morning and went to the place in which God had told him. Do you see the emphasis there? He rose early in the morning. If I was asked to give up the thing that I loved most, I would probably come up with every excuse to delay. But not Abraham. Abraham raises up early in the morning, he saddles his donkey, he gets Isaac, he gets 2 servants, and he goes on his way. This is really cool, right? A lot of the times we read Genesis 22 as Christians and we immediately jump to the Jesus connection. But I need you to understand what's being communicated in the context of Genesis, right? Here we are getting to see the story of Abraham reach its resolution, right? We saw a man of faith at the beginning of Genesis 12, but we've seen him mess up quite a bit along the way. But here at Genesis 22, we see really what this guy is made of, right? Because in Genesis 12, he was being told to give up everything and gain everything. But right here in Genesis 22, he's being told to give up everything and gain nothing in return. Right here, what God's doing is he is testing Abraham's heart, right? He wants to know, why is Abraham following him? Does Abraham follow Yahweh simply because of what he gets out of Yahweh? Or is he following Yahweh because he actually trusts him, right? I mean, it's one thing to leave everything if you're promised to, it's one thing to fork over $1 million if you're getting something that you think is worth $2 million in return, right? That's one thing, right? Because it's just a cost-benefit analysis, right? And so, up until this point in the story, you could argue that maybe Abraham was only following God because of what he thought he had to get out of it. But right here, God gives him no opportunity for that. He says, I want you to give up everything, and you're not going to get anything in return. In fact, the one thing that I have actually given to you, the one thing that serves as a down payment of my promise to you, I want you to give that thing up. I mean, Isaac is the one thing that proves that God's promise is true. And now God says, go kill your son and offer him as a sacrifice to me. He is telling Abraham, he's saying, I want you to demonstrate that you're here for me, not for anything else. And Abraham passes the test. But the thing is, you're never going to know if Abraham's truly passed the test until the moment that the sword is about to plunge down and slash Isaac's throat. Right? Because up until that moment, it could be that Abraham's testing God. Right? It could be that Abraham's just going through the motions. Right? Maybe he's trying to convince God that he's there for God, but maybe he's really just hoping God will change his mind. And so what we're going to see in Genesis 22 is that God waits until the very last moment to stop him. And so when you read the story, Abraham packs up his things, he grabs Isaac, he grabs the 2 servants, and they go on their way. Right? They make their way to the land of Moriah. They go up a hill. Abraham leaves the 2 servants down there, and Isaac is told to shoulder the wood, and they begin making their way up the mountain. a lot of times people depict Isaac as being a teenager here. According to Josephus, he's in his 20s already, right? So it seems like whatever ends up happening on top of this mountain, Isaac willingly lays himself down, right? The Bible doesn't tell us how old he is, though. And so they get up there, and Isaac looks around, and he says, well, Dad, there's an issue. We're here to offer a sacrifice, but like we got the wood and we got the fire. Where's the lamb? And God says, well, and Abraham responds and says, the Lord will provide a lamb. In Hebrew, the phrase is Yahweh Yireh, right? Yahweh will see to it. Yahweh will provide. And so they get there, they make the altar, they lay the wood down, and then Abraham communicates the bad news to his son. And he says, you're the one I'm offering. And Isaac seemingly just rolls with it. Isaac lays down on the altar, and Abraham, once again, he pulls the knife up, and he's about to kill his son. And then in that moment, this is what we read. Let me find the verse. Then they came to the place of which God had told him, and Abraham built the altar and arranged the wood, and bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of Yahweh called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham! And he said, here I am. And he said, do not stretch out your hand against the lad, and do nothing to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. This is the first time we ever encounter the phrase, fear God, in the Bible. A lot of times what I like to do is there's this thing called the principle of first usage, right? Whenever a word shows up for the first time, usually that is the author defining how it ought to be used for the rest of the story, right? It's kind of like when you're reading a textbook and the first time a vocabulary word shows up, it's something like bold and then like the definitions in italics afterwards. Kind of the same thing, right? So here we see what it means to fear God, right? And if you remember, like later on in the Bible, it says the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. The fear of God is the beginning of knowledge, right? In the book of Proverbs. To fear God is to love God so much that you are willing to give up anything else for him, right? That's what it means to fear God. Abraham was about to give up the thing that he loved most dearly, all because God told him to do it, right? Abraham did not ask for an explanation, nor did God give him an explanation, right? God didn't say, I want you to sacrifice Isaac because this is what I'm trying to accomplish. Abraham was willing to do it simply because God instructed it, right? No explanation, no justification. He was simply willing to walk in obedience. That's what it means to fear God. When God speaks, you obey no matter how much it costs you. He says, now I know that you fear God. Take the knife away. Don't kill your son. But that would not have been made clear until the moment the knife was about to kill Isaac. You see what I mean there? Mm-hmm. Right? It had to be at that moment. And so God says, don't do it. Isaac gets up. They look. And there's a ram caught in the thicket. And so they sacrifice that ram to God. And Yahweh did indeed provide. And then what's interesting is that before they leave, Abraham names the place. And he names the place Yahweh will provide. As it is said to this day, in the mount of Yahweh it will be provided. So the author of Scripture notes that whenever Abraham slaughtered the ram, that was apparently not the lamb that he had in mind that God would provide. Right? Because Abraham slaughtered the ram, and then afterwards, as he was departing, he named the place Yahweh will provide, looking to the future. And the author of the Torah specifies that on this mountain, one day, it will be provided. Well, if you know where Mount Moriah is Jerusalem, right? And so, it's a hill near Jerusalem, and historically speaking, this is why we would say as Christians that when Jesus died on the cross, Yahweh did indeed yireh, right? Yahweh did provide. Yahweh did see to it, right? Because the Torah here seems to acknowledge the fact that yes, Yahweh will provide in the future. He will provide some sort of sacrifice. And then once again, notice the language. Take now your son, your only son, whom you love, right? For God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whosoever believes in him shall not perish but have everlasting life. Right? And so the language is calling back to this moment. Right? And whenever you actually read the accounts of Jesus' crucifixion, it's the same language. Right? God is doing what Abraham didn't have to do. Right? And so it's very beautiful right there. We go to Genesis 23, right? And I know that we're having to just like blast through all this stuff. Just bear with me real quick. Sorry, I'm trying to look to see what I need to highlight here. We go to Genesis chapter 23, and Sarah has reached an old age, and Sarah dies. And really the main thing that you need to remember about Genesis chapter 23 is that this is the chapter where Abraham purchases the first piece and the only piece of land he ever owns in the land of Canaan. He needs a place to bury Sarah, and so he purchases the cave of Machpelah. And the reason this is significant is because, once again, God promised him land, seed, and blessing. Abraham has been blessed by God. He has this child named Isaac who is the seed. And so the only other thing he really needs to confirm the covenant is a piece of land. And the people try to give the land to him, but Abraham insists that it's a official transaction, right? And he wants to pay he wants to pay money for it because he wants to make this a legal thing so that nobody can just take the land back later. He says, no, this has to be legal so that now Abraham actually has a stake on the land. This then leads us to Genesis chapter 24. And whenever you get to Genesis 24, you get what is one of my favorite stories in the entire Bible, but we're going to have to just blast through it at a super quick pace. It's actually the longest chapter in the Bible. But what we see is that Isaac has grown into a young man, right? He's in his 30s now. But he is still not married. And his wife and his mom has recently died, right? And he needs comfort. And so what Abraham does is he calls over his servant. The servant is left unnamed, but usually people associate the servant with Eliezer of Damascus, who was mentioned back in Genesis 15. We don't know, though. And Abraham calls over his servant, and he makes the servant give him a promise. He says, I don't want my son to marry one of these Canaanite women, right? Because they don't worship the one true God. So he says, I want you, my servant, to go back to the land from which I came and find one of my family members, one of my relatives, and from there I want you to find a wife for my son Isaac. And so the servant goes on this mission, right? And an interesting thing about Genesis 24 is that it repeats the story over and over and over again because it's trying to highlight just the providence of God through this entire thing. I'm only going to really repeat it once just for the sake of time. But what happens is that the servant makes this long journey, right? He takes all this stuff with him. He takes all these camels. He takes all this money. He takes all this jewelry, all the way back to the land from which Abraham came. And he stops and he needs to get water at a well, right? And there's just this leitmotif throughout Scripture that, and leitmotif, if you don't know what that phrase means, it just means like a recurring theme. Anytime somebody is near a well in Scripture, usually there's marriage imagery involved. And so the servant gets to the well and he starts praying to God and he says, oh, God of my fathers, please hear my cry. Be faithful to your servant Abraham and give him a wife for Isaac. And he says, may it be that whenever the women come out to draw water from the well and I ask one of them for water, may she say, I will not only give you water, but I'll water your camels as well. And this is something very interesting, right? Because we get to see what the servant values, right? Whenever it comes to looking for a wife for his master's son, he doesn't say, oh God, make her the most beautiful woman in the world. He's looking for somebody of character, right? If you know how much water camels can drink, it's a whole lot of water, right? And the way that people had to get water then is like they were going all the way down to a spring. They had to get the water, bring it back. And if this woman says that she is going to water this man and his camels, she's probably committing to hours of work, right? For a stranger, she doesn't even know, right? So right off the bat, this would suggest a woman of very noble character, right? That's what this man values, right? He doesn't care about how beautiful the woman is. He cares specifically about her character, right? He wants somebody who would be a good helpmate for Isaac. And it tells us that as soon as, he had barely finished praying, right? This guy was probably expecting to be here for a while. He probably did not expect this to be a quick journey. But as soon as he finishes praying, lo and behold, this woman named Rebecca comes up. And whenever he asks for water, first off, he notices that she is breathtakingly beautiful. But whenever he asks for water, she does exactly as he said. She says, not only will I give you water, but I'll water your camels. And so she spends the next few minutes, if not hours, doing just that. And this guy is just in awe, right? He's worshiping God, being like, what? What are the odds of this happening exactly like this? And so he asks the woman about who she is, and it turns out that she is actually related to Abraham's family, right? And so she goes back, and her brother is Laban, who we're going to revisit again in a little bit, right? And so she's like, yeah, I actually am from Abraham's family and stuff like that. And so she goes back and tells her family, and then her family sends her to go bring the servant to the house. And they begin having a meal. And the family is really kind of just wanting the man to chill out and just relax and stay there for a bit. But we get the idea that this servant is a really good servant because he doesn't want to waste any time, right? And he says, guys, the Lord has been faithful to me so far. If you don't mind, I would like to communicate why I'm here. And it's at this point where the servant begins to detail the whole story again. He talks about the promise that God gave, he talks about the promise that Abraham made him take. He talks about his journey. He talks about being at the well. He talks about Rebekah doing all that. He gets them up on the whole thing. And he says, to me, this seems like a clear sign that Rebekah is supposed to be my master's son's wife. And Laban and all the people in the family, they say, yeah, that seems true to us. It seems like God definitely is behind this whole thing. And they say, sure, if Rebekah's fine with this, Rebekah can be the wife. And Rebekah says, I'd be honored to. And so the family's like, okay, well, here, just stay here a few more nights, and then eventually, y'all can go back home. And once again, Abraham's servant is like, guys, God has given me success thus far. Let's not waste any time, right? Let us leave immediately. And it seems like he's aware of the fact that right now these people are so impressed by the story that they're like, yes, this is God. But he seems to know a little bit about human nature with the fact that, as time passes, they might begin to justify things, be like, oh, I guess that wasn't that miraculous. And they might come up with a reason to not send Rebekah away, right? And they might not, because keep in mind, we're talking about hundreds, if not thousands of miles away from one another, right? This is hey, we're sending our sister away to never see her again, right? This is not usually a decision you would quickly make, unless it was evident that God was the one telling you to do it. And so the servant says, God has given me success this far. Please don't hold us back. Let us just go. And they say, well, it's really up to Rebekah. And this is once again where we just get to see what an amazing woman of character this woman is. Rebekah says, I'll do it. And it's really just kind of a very sweet story. I would say that Genesis 24 is probably one of the most romantic stories in the entire Bible, even though Isaac really isn't even a main character in it. It's more just the character of Rebekah through this and the character of the servant and just the way that God miraculously works all this stuff out. It really just makes it a very intriguing story as you're actually just reading through it. And so Abraham's servant packs up all the stuff. Rebekah goes. And once again, it's kind of like Rebekah's doing what Abraham did, right? Just getting up and leaving everything, right? She's going to an unknown land to marry a guy she's never even met. And it just says a whole lot about her. And this is what we read at the very end of Genesis 24. Now Isaac had come from going to Beer Lahai Roi, for he was living in the Negev. Isaac went out to meditate in the field toward evening, and he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, camels were coming. Rebekah lifted up her eyes, and when she saw Isaac, she dismounted from the camel. She said to the servant, who is the man walking in the field to meet us? And the servant said, he is my master. Then she took her veil and covered herself. The servant told Isaac all the things that he had done. Then Isaac brought her into his mother Sarah's tent, and he took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her. Thus Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. So Genesis 24 in and of itself is just a really sweet, nice story. Like I said, there's something romantic about it, even though, Isaac's just meditating in a field. And then, Rebekah gets there, and she says, who's that guy? And they say, that's your master, that's my master's son. Well, actually, no, it says that's my master, which I just think is very interesting. That's an interesting thing to me. Yeah. The entire chapter, whenever the servant refers to his master, he's talking about Abraham.
Yeah.
But in that particular part, at the very end of the chapter, he identifies Isaac as his master. And I think it's because now that Isaac's getting married, Isaac is kind of elevated to the head of the household, right? And then Rebekah puts up her veil, and she goes and marries Isaac. And I wish I could tell you that Isaac and Rebekah's marriage was going to be just super perfect. But in a few moments in this next chapter, we're going to see that it begins to not be as perfect as we would hope. So we get to Genesis 25, and really Genesis 25 is Not only is it the chapter that sets up the middle point of all of Genesis, but in addition to that, it kind of bridges the next 3 generations, right? Because in Genesis 25, what we see is we get to see Abraham's death and the birth of Isaac's sons, which is really interesting to me. And the reason why this is interesting is because if you think about it, there is no other person in Scripture other than Jesus himself whose birth is anticipated as highly as Isaac's, right? I mean, Jesus' birth is kind of anticipated in the 929 chapters of the Old Testament, right? But Isaac's birth is anticipated for 10 chapters, right? I mean, you've got 25 years of Abraham waiting for Isaac to be born, but once Isaac is born, the story just kind of fast forwards to get to Jacob, which kind of just tells something interesting to me about Isaac. He kind of just seems like a disappointment, right? If you're thinking about, and I'm not trying to say this as a negative thing about Isaac, he just doesn't seem to live up to the potential of what was set up for him, right? I mean, if you think about it, the lingering question of Genesis is who is going to be the seed to crush the serpent? Yeah. And, we had Adam, like they placed, Adam and Eve were placing their hope in Cain, and it wasn't Cain. And so there was Seth, but then you have all these generations going on and on and on. You get to Noah, and Noah's father seems to place his hope in Noah, but then it's not Noah. And then, it goes through Shem, and you follow all these generations, and you get to Abraham. And Abraham is chosen for a very significant purpose, and a lot of emphasis is put on Abraham's seed. But then Isaac, he just isn't really anything in particularly special, right? The main thing that's interesting about Isaac is his birth. And the most famous story we have about Isaac is whenever he was almost killed, right? By being offered as a sacrifice. Mm-hmm. But Isaac himself really just seems to be Abraham 2.0, but to a lesser degree, right? And so whenever you actually read the story, you get to Isaac, but Isaac really just doesn't have much of a story just to himself, right? The only chapter Isaac really gets dedicated to himself is Genesis chapter 26. And what we're going to see in that chapter is that Isaac basically just copycats what Abraham had done before, right? But in Genesis 25, what we see is that Abraham eventually does remarry after Sarah's death, and he has some more kids, right? But then eventually what we read is verse 7, these are all the years of Abraham's life that he lived, 175 years. So he got to live to see Isaac be 75 years old, which is pretty cool. Abraham breathed his last and died in a ripe old age, an old man and satisfied with life, and he was gathered to his people. So Abraham got to live in the land of Canaan for 100 years, right? He was called when he was 75, and he died at 175. Then his sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpelah in the field of Ephron, the son of Zohar the Hittite, facing Mamre, the field which Abraham purchased from the sons of Heth. There Abraham was buried with Sarah his wife. It came about after the death of Abraham that God blessed his son Isaac, and Isaac lived in Beer Lahai Roi. Right? And so, we get to see Abraham dies, and after Abraham's death, God's blessing passes to Isaac. Right? But then, like I mentioned, by the end of Genesis 25, Isaac has already had other kids. And this is what I want you to notice once we get to this story. Genesis 25, let's pick up in verse 19. Now these are the records of the generations of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham became the father of Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean of Padan Aram, the sister of Laban, the Aramean, to be his wife. Isaac prayed to Yahweh on behalf of his wife because she was barren. And Yahweh answered him, and Rebekah his wife conceived. Notice that Rebekah, like Sarah, was barren. Right? This is going to be a continuous theme here, and once again it highlights the miraculous nature of this whole story. Right? God seems to be going out of his way to pick people who are unlikely in order to bring about his promises. So that whenever his promises are fulfilled, the glory goes to him. Right? He could have picked, instead of Abraham and Sarah, he could have picked some random young couple that was ready to have kids. But instead, he picked 2 old people who were barren. And whenever Abraham's servant went to go find a wife for Isaac, God could have directed them towards a woman who was not barren. But instead, he chose Rebekah, who was barren. Right? And he does this so that whenever the babies are born, it is, just short-term reminders that the covenant is true. Then Yahweh said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples will be separated from your body. and one people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. So we have this prophecy that basically Rebekah is going to give birth to twins, right? And the older will serve the younger, which is weird, because normally it'd be the other way around, right? Normally the firstborn is the one who's elevated and exalted, whereas the secondborn serves the first. But God says it's going to be different than that here. The older one is going to serve the younger one. Okay? And her days to give birth were fulfilled, and behold, there were twins in her womb. And the first came forth red all over like a hairy garment, and they named him Esau. Afterward his brother came forth with his hand holding on to Esau's heel, so that his name was called Jacob. And Isaac was 60 years old when she gave birth to them. Right? Which is really cool. This lets us know that Abraham was alive whenever Jacob and Esau were born. Right? Because if you remember, Abraham had Isaac whenever he was 100, and he lived to be 175. And so that means that he got to see Isaac be 100, like he got to see Isaac be 75 years old. Well, Isaac was 60 whenever Jacob and Esau were born. Right? So Abraham was actually alive for 15 years of Jacob and Esau's life, which is kind of cool. The thing that's interesting here is I want you to notice what we read about Jacob here. The very first thing we learn about Jacob is that Jacob comes out holding on to Esau's heel. Right? This is the Hebrew word akeb. The previous time that we've heard this in Genesis was describing what?
The serpent?
The serpent, right? Genesis chapter 3. And I'll put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the akeb, the heel. Right? It shows up in Genesis 3. It shows up again here. This already tells us a lot about Jacob. Right? Because remember, we've had this whole conflict throughout Genesis. The lingering question is, what path are these people going to take? Are they going to choose to follow the way of the woman, or are they going to choose to follow the way of the serpent? Are they going to belong to the seed of the woman or the seed of the serpent? Well, in Jacob's birth, he's doing what the serpent does. Right? The serpent bites heels and bruises heels. Well, what is Jacob doing? He's bruising heels too, right off the bat. And he is named Jacob because Jacob literally means something along the lines of heel grabber. Right? See, it's akeb. Well, Jacob is Yaakov. Right? So it comes from the same thing. Right? So Jacob is literally, like his name literally means the heel grabber. Right? And what we're going to see in Jacob's story is that by the nature of how the blessing is passed down, he is going to be the chosen seed. Right? He is going to be the one who belongs to the blessed seed who will crush the serpent. But Jacob, throughout his story, looks a lot more like the serpent all along the way. And the way that I like to describe Jacob and Esau is that I want you to think of Thor and Loki. Right? Esau is kind of like Thor, and Jacob is a lot like Loki, if you've seen like the Marvel movies or if you're familiar with Norse mythology. Right? Esau is this very manly man. He is hairy. He's muscular. He's just this big, kind of not very smart person. Whereas Jacob is very wise. He is very shrewd. If you remember the serpent in the Garden of Eden, right? The serpent was craftier than all the beasts that God had created. Well, Jacob is going to be very serpent-like, right? Jacob is going to be a trickster. That's what it means to be heel grabber, right? He's a trickster, right? He's very cunning. He's not necessarily the most masculine macho man, right? He's more of a quiet guy. He's more reserved. And he's more thinking about how he can manipulate things for his own personal gain. And so whenever you see Jacob throughout the story, you've got to realize that he has a natural inclination, like all of us do, to follow the path of the serpent. Right? In many ways, Jacob and Esau, to me, remind me of Cain and Abel. Right? Except for the fact that Jacob is the one who actually seems to be more Cain-like in many ways, where sin is constantly crouching at his door, and Jacob wants to let sin in, but God is going to have to work it out of him. You go to Genesis 26, and you do get one chapter here over about Isaac. And like I mentioned, Isaac is simply Abraham 2.0. Right? And what you see about... I'm going to go back to Genesis 25 in a second because there's something we need to talk about Jacob there, but it does better to just deal with that in a second. Genesis 26 is the chapter where it basically that's the Isaac chapter. Right? And in the Isaac chapter, what we get to see is Isaac is just a shadow of his father, to where he goes to the people of Abimelech and he does what Abraham did best, and he turns to Rebekah and he says, "My darling, my dove, my love, my perfect one, could you tell them that you're my wife?" I mean, could you tell them that you're my sister rather than my wife? Right? So it looks like Isaac has picked up his father's worst traits, which is something that we all need to learn. Right? We have to realize that people don't simply pick up our best traits. And whenever you're a parent, your kids aren't simply learning from your virtues. They're learning from your vices as well. Right? And so Isaac apparently grew up seeing his father ask his mother to act like his sister. And so Isaac does the same thing. However, Isaac isn't even as good at that as Abraham because Isaac actually gets caught. Right? It just so happens that one of the people, like whenever they're living there, somebody is walking by and it says that they see basically Isaac and Rebekah cuddling. And they're like, wow, that's not what you do with your sister. And so basically Isaac gets found out and he has to leave. Right? And then the back half of chapter 26 details different wells that Isaac planted and stuff like that. That being said, let's talk about Jacob. Right? Because chapter 26 is the Isaac story, but the rest of what we're going to cover today is all about Jacob. And Jacob's story really begins in Genesis 27, but in order to truly understand it, what you're going to have to do is we're going to have to go back to chapter 25. But before we even do that, what I want to do is I want to introduce you to something which we call the Jacob cycle. Right? Has anybody ever heard of a chiasm?
Yes.
Right? A chiasm is it's a literary device, usually used in like poetry and stuff like that, but also used in narrative, especially back in ancient cultures, to where it basically just draws emphasis to things. Right? It's kind of like whenever you're reading a poem or something like that, and it goes like A, B, C, D, C, B, A. Right? You know, like there's like this structure to where it's like building to something in the middle. Well, some people way smarter than me have noticed that the story of Jacob, as it's found in Genesis, is told in the form of a chiasm. Right? So if you're looking at Genesis 25 and Genesis 35, if you're comparing those, they both have genealogies. Right? And then whenever you go to right after the genealogy at the end of Genesis 25, you have Rebekah struggling with childbirth, resulting in the birth of Jacob and Esau. At the end of it, you have Rachel struggling in childbirth, resulting in the birth of Benjamin. Right? And so you have these parallels. Right? You have Jacob being given the name Jacob, the heel grabber, whenever he obtains Esau's birthright. And then you have Jacob being given the name Israel, the God wrestler, right? And Jacob receives God's blessing. Right? And you work your way into the center to where eventually you get to basically Jacob having his 12 sons. Right? To where as you're reading the story, the emphasis seems to be on the fact that Jacob is having 12 sons. Right? It's the idea that the nation is being born. Right? So that's what the author of Genesis is highlighting. Right? And you can understand the story of Jacob by just reading it straight through. But if you notice these parallels, whenever you get to the story of the tribes of Israel being born, you'll understand that that's where the emphasis is being placed. Right? The emphasis is on the fact that finally you have a nation being born. Right? Because Abraham had Isaac. Well, that's one kid. Isaac has Jacob and Esau. Those are two kids. Well, Jacob has 12 sons. And those 12 sons are going to be the tribes of Israel. And so when you look at the Jacob cycle, this is where the emphasis is placed. But like I said, we have to start in Genesis 25. So let's look at Genesis 25, starting in verse 19. This is what we read. Now these are the records of the generations of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham became the father of Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel the Aramean of Paddan Aram, the sister of Laban the Aramean, to be his wife. Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was barren, and Yahweh answered him, and Rebekah's wife conceived. But the children struggled together within her, and she said, "If it is so, why then am I this way?" So she went to inquire of Yahweh. Notice once again, Rebekah struggling with childbirth, right? And she seeks an oracle. She asks of God. Well, Yahweh says to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 nations will be separated from your body, and one will be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. When her days to be delivered were fulfilled, behold, there were twins in her womb. Now the first came forth red, all over like a hairy garment, and they named him Esau. The name Esau means red. Afterward, his brother came forth from his hand, holding on to Esau's heel, and his name was called Jacob, a.k.a. heel grabber. And Isaac was 60 years old when she gave birth to him. So that's all stuff we've already read. And then we read this. When the boys grew up, Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the field. But Jacob was a peaceful man, living in tents. Right? So you have a hunter contrasted by a peaceful man. The idea that you get is that Esau is like a manly man hunter who's like very aggressive and boisterous. Whereas Jacob is peaceful. Right? He's just pretty chill. Right? Esau's the extrovert, Jacob's the introvert. right? Jacob just rather would stay home and chill. Now, Isaac loved Esau because he had a taste for game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. So we get to see that a split is beginning to form in the family, right? Don't go to the book of Genesis if you're looking for healthy family dynamics. So the two people pick favorites, right? Isaac, he favors Esau, and why is it that he likes Esau?
He likes game.
He likes food.
On that side.
No. So game refers to food, right? It's referring to like the type of food, right? The man to a way's heart is through his stomach, right? The man to a way's heart is through his stomach. Well, that proved true back in Genesis as well, right? Esau was the hunter. Esau is the one who brought home the steak. And so Isaac loved Esau more. Jacob always hung out at home. And who's probably always hanging out at home? Mom, right? So Jacob's a mama's boy and Esau's a daddy's boy, right? And so they each have their favorites. Now, when Jacob had cooked stew, Esau came in from the field and he was famished. And Esau said to Jacob, "Please let me have a swallow of that red stuff there, for I am famished." Therefore, his name was called Edom, right? Edom also means red. And the land of Edom is south of Ammon and Moab, right? It's the land it's part of what we'd also know as Jordan nowadays, or if you've ever seen Petra and the Red Rock Canyons there, that's the land of Edom. But Jacob said, "First sell me your birthright." Esau said, "Behold, I'm about to die. Of what use to me is this birthright?" And Jacob said, "First swear to me." So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate and drank and rose and went on his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. We need to clarify something about birthright and blessing, right? The birthright is what would be given, so in general, birthright and blessing would be given to the firstborn son, right? In many ways, if you're just kind of wanting to think of it like this, the birthright is the physical inheritance, whereas the blessing is more so the spiritual inheritance, right? So the birthright would go to the firstborn, and that would include, whenever the dad dies, the birthright would include the, the amount of land that you receive, the amount of money you received, right? It's your inheritance, right? And typically the firstborn would receive more than the secondborn, and sometimes the firstborn would just receive all of it, right? And so Esau, he has the birthright because he is the firstborn. The blessing also would be going to Esau, maybe. Right? It seems like really Isaac is the one to decide who the blessing goes to, but who is Isaac's favorite kid? Esau, right? And so if Isaac has his pick, it's going to go to Esau. But the blessing is more the spiritual component of the inheritance, and this is something that we see specifically tied to the Abrahamic covenant, right? So the birthright is just physical inheritance, whereas the blessing seems to be the promise of the blessed seed to crush the serpent, right? It is the Abrahamic blessing, the Abrahamic covenant. Who is that going to go through, right? That is what really seems to be at play here. And what we're going to see is that Jacob swindles Esau and Isaac out of both. First, he steals the birthright. And like I mentioned, Jacob, this whole story is going to look a lot more like the devil, right? The devil, whenever we're introduced to him, the serpent, he's crafty, right? He bruises heels. Well, we're introduced to we're introduced to Jacob bruising Esau's heel, and now he's going to be crafty, right? So Esau comes home one day, he is exhausted, he's famished, he's tired, he's hungry, he's grumpy, he's hangry, all that stuff, and he says, "Bro, give me some of that food." And Jacob sees his opportunity, right? He knows that Esau's not thinking straight, he knows that Esau's weak, and he says, "I'll give you this food if you give me your birthright." And Esau, I don't know if he's just dumb, or if I don't know if he was just that hungry, but he says, "You know what? I don't care about the birthright. I want food," right? It seems like Esau is the type of guy who thinks about the here and now and doesn't think about long term, right? He's like, "I don't care about the long term stuff. I don't care about the birthright. I want food now. And so if that's what it takes, sure, you can have my birthright." And so it says Esau despises the birthright, right? Esau just didn't seem to think much of it, right? And so he just hands it over for a bowl of soup. Well, that's pretty crazy because if you think about it, Isaac is pretty dang rich, right? He received everything from Abraham, right? And Abraham was pretty rich. And then God blessed Isaac in addition to all that, right? So Isaac has got a lot. And now all that stuff is going to Jacob, right? And so now Jacob is receiving both, right? And Esau's receiving basically nothing. So that's in Genesis 25, right? If you're continuing down the cycle, you get to Genesis 26, which is the interlude, right? We get to see Rebekah going to a foreign place where she has there's a foreign pact made, right? That's where you have the story about Isaac going down to Abimelech. He gives Rebekah over to Abimelech, but then they catch the whole cuddling session going on. And then Abimelech and Isaac eventually make a treaty and a pact together, right? So that's the interlude, right? And then you get to Genesis 27, and what Jacob's going to do is he is going to make another deceptive move. All right. I'm having to look at the next slides just to make sure that I don't have to click yet. Genesis 27, this is what we read. Now it came about when Isaac was old and his eyes were too dim to see that he called his older son Esau and said to him, "My son." And he said to him, "Here I am." Isaac said, "Behold, now I am old and I do not know the day of my death. Now then, please take your gear, your quiver and your bow, and go out to the field and hunt game for me, and prepare a savory dish for me, such as I love, and bring it to me that I may eat, so that my soul may bless you before I die." Now, it's kind of funny that Isaac thinks he's about to die, because it turns out that he's got a lot more years left in him, and he's not going to die anytime soon. But he wants to be careful, right? And there's one thing that is mentioned at the very beginning of this that is going to be relevant in a second, and that is the fact that Isaac cannot see, right? Isaac, he's gotten kind of blind. Back in the day, they didn't have like fancy glasses or contacts that you could put in there. They didn't have LASIK surgery. So his eyesight's going out, and he seems to be getting weaker. And so he thinks, I might be dying soon, and so I want to give you my blessing, right? Keep in mind, Esau has already given up the birthright. Well, now, guess what he's going to be giving up in a second as well? The blessing. And so, Isaac seems to have food on his mind, hence why he called Esau forward. Esau's favorite son. He says, "I'm going to give the blessing to you." He says, "What I want you to do, buddy, is I want you to go out, and I want you to hunt for some game, and I want you to bring back my favorite meal." And so Esau says, "All right, Dad, you got it." So Esau goes away, and he begins to go hunting. But here's the catch. Rebekah, Isaac's wife, overheard this conversation. And she figures out what's going on, and she goes and gets Jacob and says, "Jacob, I've got a plan." Remember how I mentioned that Rebekah started off really good, but very quickly we see that there's some conflict? This is not a healthy family dynamic, right? Apparently Isaac and Rebekah are not on the same page, and this favoritism is really bad, right? So Rebekah, she tells Jacob, "Hey, here's the deal. Your brother just went off to go get some food, which means that we've got a very narrow window to trick your dad into giving you the blessing." Once again, not healthy family dynamic. And at this point, I wish I could say that Jacob remarked and said, "Mother, how could we ever do this vile thing? How could we ever deceive Father in such a wicked and treacherous way?" But that's not what Jacob's concerned about. Instead, Jacob is just very practical about this. And he says, "All right, Mom, I'm down for this, but here's a few things you haven't thought about yet." Right? Jacob has no issues with actually deceiving his father. The issues he has is that he wants to pull it off really well. And so he says, "Mom, what about the fact that Esau's super hairy and I'm not?" And his mom says, "Don't worry, I got this." Right? And so what ends up happening is this. They cook up some food, and they slaughter an animal that basically Rebekah uses the skin of, and basically she makes a costume for Jacob. Right? Which tells you that Esau must have been super hairy. Right? Because they kill a goat, and apparently the goat skin feels roughly equivalent to Esau's body. Like, this dude is like Chewbacca level hairy. It's wild, right? If evolutionists were reading the story and they encountered Esau, they would think he's the missing link. Like, this dude is a hairy person. And so they make some food and they make Jacob a costume. And as you're reading the story, you can't help but feel the tension in the room, because you realize that they are working like on a time limit, right? Because they have to get all of this done. They have to make the food, they have to make the costume, and they have to do this whole heist thing all in the time before Esau gets back from hunting. And so that's what they're doing. Like, they're thinking really quick, and it tells you how shrewd they are, right? The fact that they're able to hatch this whole plan this quickly tells you a whole lot about them. And so Jacob finally goes in, and this is what we read in this story. Then he came to his father. This is verse 18. He came to his father and said, "My father." And he said, "Here I am. Who are you, my son?" And Jacob said to his father, "I am Esau, your firstborn. I have done as you told me. Get up, please. Sit and eat of my game, that you may bless me." And now what I want you to notice here is that Isaac seems to catch on very quickly to what's happening here. Notice that he's going to see all the red flags. Isaac said to his son, "How is it that you have made it so quickly, my son?" And he said, "Because Yahweh your God has caused it to happen to me." Notice how Jacob brings Yahweh into the deception, right? He could have simply said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I don't know, I got it done quickly." But Jacob says, "Oh, the reason why I was able to be back so quick is because Yahweh gave me favor." He's literally pulling Yahweh into the deception, which I think is kind of messed up. And that's also an example of using God's name in vain, right? No, God did not do this to you. You are doing this yourself. You are acting like the serpent, not like God. So Isaac, right off the bat, he's like, "You seem back kind of quick." So he notices that's an issue. And Isaac said to Jacob, "Please come close that I may feel you, my son, whether you are really my son Esau or not." So he seems to be onto something, to where he's like, I need to make sure this is actually Esau, because something seems sketchy here. And he's probably aware of the fact that his other son, Jacob, is a conniving heel grabber. So he says, "Come over here and let me actually feel you. I want to make sure this is Esau." So Jacob came close to Isaac his father, and he felt him and said, "The voice is the voice of Jacob, but the hands are the hands of Esau." Once again, he's seeing the red flags. He says, "Well, now I'm really confused. This guy came back way too quick, and he feels hairy like Esau, but his voice sounds like Jacob." Right? And so it seems like Isaac's kind of picking up on the fact that this isn't actually Esau. But it seems like, just like Esau despised the birthright and didn't think much of it, it seems like Isaac isn't really going to think that much of the blessing either. He did not recognize him because his hands were hairy like his brother Esau's hands, so he blessed him. Right? So Isaac, either, once again, he's not that smart, in which case we might see where Esau got it from, or he just didn't care that much about the blessing. Right? It's hard to say. But that's why I hate to break it. Like Isaac's not bad. He's just, once again, disappointing. Right? He doesn't show the same reverence for these things like Abraham did. Right? He just seems like a lesser version of his father. Right? Not necessarily bad, just weaker. Yeah. And his faith doesn't seem as noble or impressive. Right? He's just kind of there. And he said to him, "Are you really my son Esau?" And he said, "I am." Right? He even checks again. "Are you sure you're Esau?" It's like, dude, and you would think at this point that he'd say, "Maybe I should call somebody else in here just to double check." But he doesn't do any of that. Right? He's very skeptical, yet he's just going to go along with it. So he said, "Bring it to me, and I will eat of my son's game, that I may bless you." So he brought it to him, and he ate, and he also brought him wine and drank. Then his father Isaac said to him, "Please come close and kiss me, my son." So he came close and kissed him, and when he smelled the smell of his garments, he blessed him and said, "See, the smell of my son is like the smell of a field which Yahweh has blessed. Now may God give you the dew of heaven, and of the fatness of the earth, and an abundance of the grain and new wine. May people serve you, and nations bow down to you. Be master of your brothers, and may your mother's sons bow down to you. Cursed be those who curse you, and blessed be those who bless you." Right? So Isaac, caught into the deception, blesses Jacob. Right? And then what we read, "Now it came about, as soon as Isaac had finished blessing Jacob, and Jacob had hardly got out of the presence of Isaac his father, that Esau his brother came in from his hunting." Right? If this were a heist movie, it would be perfectly dramatic. Right? Here, there's been this time crunch, and Jacob and his mother have pulled it off to perfection. And just as Jacob sneaks out the tent and goes around the other side, Esau comes in. And Esau comes to his father and says, "I'm here for my blessing." And this is where Isaac really begins to realize what he's done wrong. He says, "Wait, I already blessed you." And Esau says, No, you didn't. That wasn't me. That was Jacob. He stole my birthright. Now he stole my blessing." And Esau's getting, understandably upset by this. Right? And then he says, "Well, Father, can't you bless me as well?" And Isaac seems to understand that whenever he spoke forth that blessing, he was not simply speaking forth human words. He was prophesying. Right? He was speaking forth the very words of God. And he says, "Son, that's not how it works." And Esau says, "Just try anyways." And so he tries, but he says this, "Behold, away from the fertility of the earth shall be your dwelling, and away from the dew of heaven from above. By your sword you shall live, and your brother you shall serve." But it shall come about that when you become restless, you will break his yoke from your neck. So on one hand, Jacob is going to he's going to live in a land flowing with milk and honey. Right? He's going to live in a fat land flowing with all luxurious agriculture. Esau is going to dwell away from the fatness of the land. He's going to dwell in desert regions. That is the prophecy over Esau. Kind of a bummer. Understandably, Esau is furious about this. And so Rebekah comes to Jacob and says, hey, I think it might be a good idea for you to get out of here. Right? And so that's exactly what Jacob does. Right? Jacob goes back to his dad and says, hey, I think I need to get out of here. And Rebekah tells Isaac, you know what? Maybe what Jacob needs to do is he needs to go get a wife for himself as well. Right? Just like Abraham sent his servant to go get a wife for you, maybe you need to send Jacob to get a wife for himself. And so Isaac says, okay, cool. And so Rebekah tells Jacob to get out for a few days, just until Esau has cooled off. You kind of get the impression that they think that Esau, once again, isn't very smart, and that after a few days, he'll forget what he's even mad about. And so Jacob leaves. He's going to be gone for over 20 years. Right? And so, as we're following through the Jacob cycle, we go from deception, taking the blessing from Esau, into Jacob's first vision. Right? As Jacob's fleeing, we find Jacob in a very strange place. Right? Think about it. This is a guy who presumably grew up with a silver spoon. Right? His family, they didn't have like a permanent dwelling. They're just nomads wandering around. But they're rich nomads, right? Jacob has always had everything. But now here he is on the run, basically a fugitive from his own family, exiled. And it says that he had nothing to sleep on except for, he just had to pull out a stone, right? And so as he's traveling up north, he's heading back to where Abraham and them originally came from. He's heading north and he lays down to take a nap, to sleep in the middle of the night. He grabs a stone, he lays his head upon it, he falls asleep. And he has a vision. And in this vision, Jacob sees a ladder reaching up to heaven. And angels of God ascending and descending upon it. Right? And God himself, he sees there. And God speaks from the ladder. And this is what God says. Let's see. He had a dream, and behold, a ladder was set on the earth, with its top reaching into heaven. And behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And behold, Yahweh stood above it and said, I am Yahweh, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie, I will give it to you and to your seed. Your seed will also be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. And in you and all of your seed shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. So Yahweh shows up and he reaffirms the fact that the Abrahamic blessing will indeed go through Jacob. He says, as I was with Abraham and as I was with Isaac, so I will be with you. Which is interesting, right? So despite the fact that Jacob has deceived his way into this, God is going to honor it. Right? And that's what I think is very interesting about the Jacob story. Right? All because somebody is walking in the footsteps of the serpent doesn't mean they're totally gone. Right? God can still use that person. But what we're going to see is that God is going to have to work the serpent out of Jacob. Right? He's going to have to work that deception out. And that's what's going to happen during Jacob's exile. Right? It's very similar. Like Jacob's story here is foreshadowing what's going to happen with the people of Israel. Right? Whenever the people of Israel sin, they are exiled in order to face discipline. And once they learn their lesson, they come back. Well, Jacob's going to be the same way. Right? Jacob has been a heel grabber. He's a deceiver. He's walking in the ways of the serpent. He's going to have to leave to learn a lesson. And so God says, I'm going to be with you. And Jacob wakes up and he says, surely Yahweh was in this place and I did not know it. And he names that place Bethel, the house of God. And then Jacob says this. He says, if God will be with me and will keep me on this journey I take, and will give me food to eat and garments to wear, and I return to my father's house in safety, then Yahweh will be my God, and this stone which I have set up as a pillar will be God's house, and of all that you will give me, I will surely give a tenth to you. Here is where we once again get to see Jacob being Jacob. Jacob only knows how to swindle. Jacob does not know how to receive a free gift. Right? God has just promised to be with Jacob no matter what, but Jacob feels like he has to work for it. Right? He feels like he has to do something in order to make things even. And so God said, I will be with you. And Jacob says, if you are with me, and if you hold up your end of the deal, when I get back, you'll be my God. That's not exactly how you should respond, right? You should respond and say, you'll be my God this point going forward. But that's not how he says. He says, if God will be with me, it's a challenge, it's a test. But the thing is, once again, Yahweh is faithful. And God has already made this promise to Jacob, so he's not going to renege it. He's not going to go back. And so, he will bring Jacob back. And sure enough, once Jacob comes back into the land, God will appear to him again. And Jacob will say, okay, you're my God going forward. Right? But here, Jacob tests God. If you bring me back, then you'll be my God. And so what we enter into here is a problem. Right? Here we have the chosen seed of the woman who looks a lot more like the seed of the serpent. He's going to have to make a change. And if Michael Jackson has taught me anything, if you're going to make a change, who do you have to start with?
Yourself, I'm guessing?
I'm starting with the
Man in the mirror.
man in the mirror.
Yes.
Right? You start with the man in the mirror. So what we're going to see is that Jacob is going to have to come into contact with someone who can beat him at his own game. Right? If Jacob is a heel grabber, he's going to have to encounter another heel grabber, and he's going to have to get a taste of his own medicine in order to learn how terrible heel grabbing is. Right? If he follows the way of the serpent, he has to meet somebody even craftier than himself. And that's exactly what happens during his exile. Right? If you're following the Jacob cycle, you have the vision in Bethel, and then his exile begins. Right? You get to Genesis 29, and Jacob arrives at Haran, and this is where he meets Rachel. Jacob goes to get water at a well, and for all I know, this could be the very same well that Abraham's servant went to back in Genesis chapter 24. And lo and behold, what's he going to do? He's going to meet a woman. I'm going to have to condense this down just for the sake of time, but Jacob meets Rachel, and immediately he is smitten by her. Like he looks at her and he's just like, wow, this woman is amazing. Like, this is one of those things where, like, if this were a cartoon, you know, the character lays his eyes on this girl, and then all of a sudden his eyes turn into hearts that start pulsating in and out of his head, and jazz music starts playing in the background. That's what happens when Jacob sees Rachel. He sees her and immediately he is undone. He loves this woman and he wants to be with her. And so he has to meet Rachel's father, Laban, who, if you remember, was Rebekah's brother. Well, he's taken to meet Laban, and Laban makes a deal with him. And Laban says, all right, I would love to have you marry my daughter. In fact, if you work for me for 7 years, I will let you marry Rachel. And Jacob says, absolutely, I would be happy to do that. Please let me marry her. And this is what we read. So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed to him but a few days because of his love for her. One of the most romantic things in the Bible. But at the same time, I do want to highlight something. Because what we're going to see here is that there is a big difference between how Abraham's servant picked a wife for Isaac and how Jacob picks a wife for himself. Because Abraham's servant, do you remember what he was focusing on?
The character.
He was focusing on good character, right? And it just so happened that Rebekah happened to be beautiful. Jacob, though, he is focusing on the looks.
Yes.
And this kind of goes, this is kind of how it works, right? This is the problem that we're facing nowadays, right? Back whenever most marriages were arranged, usually families would consider things more than simply external beauty, right? They would focus on the character of the family and the character of the person that their child was going to marry, right? Whereas nowadays, whenever we're, picking our own spouses, a lot of the times one of the biggest issues is that people are simply focusing on looks, right? Which paves the way for a lot of problems. Well, what we're going to see here is that Laban has 2 daughters, right? Leah is the older one, and Rachel is the younger one, right? The way the Bible describes them is that Rachel is stunningly beautiful, right? It says that she is beautiful in form and in appearance, right? So not only did she have a good face, she had a good body as well, right? She's beautiful, whereas Leah is weak on the eyes, right? The idea is that Leah is kind of ugly, right? Which is sad, right? But the thing is, whenever you actually compare the two, Leah seems to be the more faithful one. Leah seems to be the one who is more respectable and honorable. Rachel, she worships other gods. She has idols. But Jacob, He's focused on looks. He sees Rachel and he says, hubba hubba, me wanty. And so he works 7 years for Rachel, and the wedding day finally comes. And once again, just for the sake of summary, things do not go as planned, right? Jacob, you can just imagine the scene, right? It's a nighttime wedding. Everybody's having a great time, and the bride would always come out veiled, right? And so he can't see her face or anything. And knowing Jacob, he probably gets super duper drunk over the course of this night. And then eventually him and his wife retreat back into the tent where he finally removes her veil. Maybe it's too dark for him to see her face. Maybe he's so drunk he doesn't care. He sleeps with her. He wakes up in the morning and he looks and sees that is not Rachel. It's Leah, the older sister. Jacob is furious. He says, what the heck? I agreed to marry Rachel, not Leah. And this is where Laban proves to be the perfect foil for Jacob. You know how I said Jacob needed to meet the man in the mirror?
Mm-hmm.
Meet Laban. Right? Laban looks and says, oh, I'm so sorry. Did I say you would marry Rachel? I forgot to explain to you a custom that we have in our culture. We never marry off the second daughter before the first. So I had to marry you off to Leah. If you want to marry Rachel as well, you're going to have to work another 7 years. So now, Laban has tricked Jacob into working not only for 7 years, but for 14 years. And he's gotten both of his daughters married. Right? So just like Jacob was a swindler and a trickster, so Laban also is a swindler and a trickster. And Jacob has to get a taste of his own medicine. And so, what happens is that Jacob is married to Leah for a week, and then he's allowed to marry Rachel as well. But then he has to work another 7 years to pay off that debt. Right? And during this time period, what we see is the actual focal point of the entire Jacob story. We get to see the birth of the tribes of Israel. And do y'all mind if we go a little bit over today?
Sure.
Okay,
Absolutely.
cool. Just making sure. Because I'd like to get to a certain point. All right. So here we are. We get to the end of Genesis chapter 29, and this is what we read starting in verse 31. Oh, on the wrong page. Now Yahweh saw that Leah was unloved, and he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. Well, that's interesting. You see how we get to see the heart of God there? Right? Because poor Leah, I feel really bad for Leah. And you're going to feel really bad for Leah as this story progresses. Because what we're going to see is that poor Leah is just the innocent victim in all of this. Right? Her dad seemingly married her off because he knew that nobody else would want to marry her because apparently she was just not a good-looking woman. But she seems to be nothing but a faithful wife. And she actually seems to be pretty faithful to Yahweh also. Right? I mean, all of Laban's family seems to be kind of jacked up, but Leah seems to be the best of the bunch. Right? And Rachel, the only reason that Jacob loves her more is because of how beautiful she is. And this is one thing that Jacob is never going to get over. Right? Even after Rachel dies, Jacob is going to show extreme favoritism to Rachel's children over all the others. Right? This is simply how it's going to be. It's actually really sad and really messed up. But God has compassion on people like that. Right? He sees that Leah is a victim of her circumstances, kind of like Hagar. And he has compassion on her. And so he allows Leah to have kids while he keeps Rachel barren. Right? In order to kind of even the field a little bit. Another thing I want to notice here is, I've already kind of highlighted this before, but if you notice the trend, Abraham and Sarah, barren and old. Isaac and Rebekah, barren and old. Jacob and his wives, as we're going to see in the next few chapters, they struggle with barrenness. This reemphasizes something that I've already mentioned earlier today. God loves putting his people into impossible situations so that in the end, 1, he gets the glory, and 2, they are forced to live by faith. This is not going to stop in Genesis. It's going to be something that continues throughout the rest of Scripture. And so that's something that we need to learn right off the bat. If you go into Genesis chapters 29 and 30, we get into a section what one of my professors likes to call womb wars. Right? Because what we see happen very quickly is that the women start fighting amongst each other over who can have more children. And Leah, by the grace of God, is going to win by a landslide. And each of these kids gets different names just in response to the nature of their birth. And for Leah, most of the children, it's actually just really, really sad. Most of the children are going to be coming from her desire to be loved by Jacob, right? And so just to show some examples of this, what we're going to see is it says, Leah conceived and bore a son and named him Reuben. For she said, because Yahweh has seen my affliction, surely now my husband will love me. Right? She says, okay, God saw my affliction. I have this child, and she names him Reuben because that's what the name Reuben means. And she says, now Jacob will love me. But Jacob still doesn't love her. Right? She's thinking, maybe now that I've given him a kid, Jacob will love me. Then she conceived again and bore a son and said, because Yahweh has heard that I am unloved, he has therefore given me this son also. So she named him Simeon. Right? Shimon, to hear. Right? God has heard me. He's heard that I'm unloved. He's given me a child. She conceived again and bore a son. Now my husband will become attached to me, because I have borne him 3 sons. Therefore she named him Levi. Levi means attached. Fourthly, she conceived again and bore a son and said, this time I will praise Yahweh. Therefore she named him Judah, and she stopped bearing. Right? So Leah, I feel so bad for this woman. Yeah. All she wants is the love of her husband. And the thing is, she is his main wife. Right? I mean, you're not supposed to have multiple wives. And even though Jacob got tricked into marrying Leah, that is his wife now. And so he should be giving all of his devotion to her. But he's not. Instead, he's neglecting her all because of his lust for Rachel. And so I feel so bad for Leah here. And every one of her kids is named after that. But this is where the war begins to break out. Because Rachel begins to realize that she is not able to have any kids. And so what she does is she takes her maidservant, Bilhah, and gives her to Jacob as a wife. That doesn't seem like that would fix things in any way. And it's not, right? But more kids are going to be born, right? This is a very dangerous situation, right? I mean, already, if you've ever seen like sisters growing up with one another, they already bicker enough. Marry them off to the same guy? I mean, it's already not healthy to have multiple wives. 2 of those wives being sisters? Not healthy. Right? So once again, don't go to Genesis for healthy family dynamics. So Bilhah is given to Jacob, and Jacob has 2 kids from her. Right? That would be Dan and Naphtali. Well, Leah looks at this and says, well, 2 can play at that game. And so she gives her maidservant Zilpah to Jacob, and Jacob has 2 kids with her as well, Gad and Asher. And it's at this point where God says, you know what? It seems like God's kind of tired of other women being given to Jacob. Jacob's probably having the time of his life, right? He only wanted 1 wife, and now he's stumbled into having 4 women. I mean, like, normally, like, the only way this ends up happening is from people being corrupt and powerful. Jacob stumbled into having 4 wives, right? He only wanted to marry Rachel, but now Rachel's the only one not having kids. And God seems to get kind of tired of all these, women being given up, and so he opens up Leah's womb again, and Leah bears 3 more children. Issachar, Zebulun, and a girl named Dinah, or Dinah, right? She's going to come back into the story later on. We go on, and finally, at long last, Rachel has a child. And this is what we read in verse 22. Then God remembered Rachel, and God gave heed to her and opened her womb. So she conceived and bore a son and said, God has taken away my reproach. She named him Joseph, saying, may Yahweh give me another son. And so, that's how the story of Jacob's going so far. Right? Jacob now has 12 children, 11 sons. Right? He's going to have 1 more son, but that's not going to happen quite yet. Right? That's going to happen when Rachel, unfortunately, dies. If you keep reading through chapter 30, actually, let me go back to the Jacob cycle just to make this a little bit easier on us right here. All right, so we have the multiplication, right? And that's where the text is emphasizing, right? Because narratively speaking, these children are the emphasis of the story because, this is Israel's history being born right here, right? These are the tribes, right? You've got Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Gad, Asher, Naphtali. Like all of them are being born right here. And that is going to shape things going forward. So that's what the text is emphasizing. But now, as you read the rest of the story, what you're going to see is we're going to begin working our way back out. Right? So, right before the multiplication, right? Well, what we saw, I forgot to mention this part. Right? If you read the end of chapter 30, what we get to see is we actually get to see God not only blessing Jacob's like women, but he's also blessing the flocks, right? So Jacob actually, there's like this weird miraculous thing with like spotted animals and stuff like that we don't need to get into. But God actually blesses Jacob and multiplies his flocks, so he becomes very, very wealthy while working for Laban, which is pretty crazy because remember, whenever Jacob goes back home, he's already going to be receiving the inheritance, and he's going to be receiving the blessing, which includes land, seed, and blessing. And now he's become rich according to his own workings. That's pretty crazy, right? He left with nothing, right? He literally was having to sleep on a rock whenever he left. But now that he's off in exile, he's actually getting all this stuff, and he's going to go back a very rich person. So God blesses him. But then finally, chapter 31, his exile comes to an end. Jacob has realized that he's met his match in Laban, and so he realizes that you got to fight fire with fire. And so he's going to deceive Laban, and he's going to escape, right? He decides, he tells his family, hey, we're going to pack up, and we are going to leave, and we're going to get out of here. And so that's what they do. That's really, like, just to summarize chapter 31 very briefly, that is what they do. They pack up their stuff, they get up, and they begin to leave. And when Laban hears about this, he is furious. He picks up his stuff, he chases after them, he's like, hey, what the heck? Those are my daughters. A lot of that stuff is my stuff. What are you doing? And Jacob responds and is like, hey, homie, those are my wives now, and this is my stuff that I got from you. But before Laban even gets the opportunity to actually confront Jacob, God actually appears to him, and let me see if I can find where those verses are at. Okay, verse 25. Laban caught up with Jacob. Now Jacob had pitched his tent in the hill country, and Laban with his kinsmen camped in the hill country of Gilead. Then Laban said to Jacob, what have you done by deceiving me and carrying away my daughters like captives of the sword? Why did you flee secretly and deceive me, and did not tell me that I might have sent you away with joy and with songs, with timbrel and with lyre, and did not allow me to kiss my sons and daughters? Now you have done foolishly. It is in my power to do you harm, but the God of your father spoke to me last night, saying, be careful not to speak either good or bad to Jacob. Right? So when Laban gets there, he says, dude, I really want to smack you in the face because you didn't say goodbye. But the thing is, Jacob knows as much as we do that if he had tried to tell Laban goodbye, Laban would not have let him leave. Right? Jacob has been trying to get out of there for a while, and Laban keeps sneaking in ways to make Jacob stay longer. Right? Jacob was only supposed to be gone for a little bit, and now 20 years have passed. Right? And so Jacob knows that saying goodbye would not have ever worked. Right? But Laban's like, dude, I would have told you goodbye. It would have been fine. And he says, I really want to punch you in the face, but God made me promise not to. And so what they end up doing is they end up making a covenant, and they basically agree to just not cross paths again. Right? Each person to stay in their own territory. And then they depart. Well, this leads us back into the land. If you remember, whenever Jacob was getting ready to go on his exile, he had a vision of God. Right? Well, now that he's come back into the land, guess what's going to happen? If everything's parallel, if he had a vision of God when he was leaving, what's going to happen when he comes back in? Thank you. Yes, he's going to have a vision of God. Right? And this is how it all sets up. We get to Exodus 32, and Jacob hears some very scary news. Verse 3. Then Jacob sent messengers before him to his brother Esau in the land of Seir, the country of Edom. He also commanded them, saying, thus you shall say to my lord Esau, thus says your servant Jacob, I have sojourned with Laban, and stayed until now. I have oxen and donkeys, and flocks, and male and female servants, and I have sent them to tell my lord that I may find favor in your sight. So, Jacob's coming back from his exile, and he realizes that he has got some situations he needs to fix. He's like, well, the reason I left is because Esau was ticked off at me. So maybe what I need to do is I need to begin to suck up to my brother Esau. Right? Because that's really his number one problem going back into the land. And so he sends people ahead and says, hey, Esau, my brother, it's so good to hear from you and good to see you. Just so you know, I'm super duper rich, and so if you need anything at all, I've got you. And then the messengers returned to Jacob, saying, we came to your brother Esau, and furthermore, he is coming to meet you, and 400 men are with him.
400.
Oh, crud. Jacob hears this, And this is when Jacob wishes he wore his brown pants.
Yeah.
Because he's like, oh no. And Jacob begins to think, well, darn. What does Jacob think's happening here?
That he's going to get killed or something.
Well, yeah, if he hears Esau's coming to you with 400 men, what does he think those 400 men are?
An army.
An army.
Yes.
And he's like, oh crud, I'm screwed. This is not going to go well. Right? So Jacob was greatly distressed. And he divided the people who were with him and the flocks and the herds and the camels into 2 companies. For he said, if Esau comes to one company and attacks it, then the company that is left will escape. And this is where Jacob, notice what he does. He cries out to God. O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, O Yahweh, who said to me, return to your country and your relatives, and I will prosper you. I am unworthy of all the hesed and of all the emet, the faithfulness that you have shown to your servant. For with my staff only I crossed the Jordan, and now I have become 2 companies. Deliver me, I pray, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, that he will come and attack me and the mothers and children. So, remember, after Jacob had the vision before, he made a conditional statement. If God brings me back to the land, he will be my God. Well, right here, before Jacob has the vision, he says, God, you've brought me back to the land, and I'm definitely ready to serve you now. And I'm glad I'm going to serve you because I really need you to help me out. I think Esau's on his way to kill me. So Jacob is scared. And so what happens is that night, Jacob takes his family, and he puts them on the other side of the river. He goes up a mountain, and he begins to and he goes to sleep, right? I don't know why he did this. I don't know if maybe he just wanted to be the first one whenever he wakes up, he's on the mountain and he can see in the distance where Esau's at. I don't know if maybe he wanted to get away and pray. I don't know what he was planning, but this is what we read happens on that night. Then Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When he saw that he had not prevailed against him, he touched the socket of his thigh. So the socket of Jacob's thigh was dislocated while he wrestled with him. Then he said, let me go, for the dawn is breaking. But he said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. So he said to him, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. And he said, your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel. For you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. So here's what happened. It's a weird story. Jacob is trying to go to bed. And then in the middle of the night, some random man shows up and starts wrestling with him. Now, you can imagine what Jacob's thinking. Jacob's probably thinking it's Esau. I don't know. And Jacob starts wrestling with this guy. And the wrestling match keeps on going. Right? It just keeps on going, nonstop. And eventually, it's just so it's so evenly matched that the guy reaches out and he pops Jacob's hip out of socket like it's nothing. What does this tell you?
That is definitely not no humans.
Well, not necessarily. But what does it tell you about how the one dude's been fighting?
Fighting very good.
Well, if he was able to easily just reach out and pop Jacob's hip out of socket, it would imply that he's been taking it pretty easy on Jacob. Right? Yeah. The only reason Jacob has been able to wrestle this long is because the other dude's been taking it easy on him. And after Jacob's been wrestling this long, the guy says, okay, I'm getting impatient, and he pops Jacob's hip out of socket. Which immediately should tell you that Jacob is fighting a battle that he is not equipped for. And then the guy tells Jacob to stop fighting. And now Jacob, here he is. Think about how pathetic this is. Right? Jacob is an old man at this point. Right? His hip is popped out of socket. He can barely function. Yet he still won't let go. And even though it is evident that this other guy is more powerful than him, Jacob says, I'm not letting go until you bless me. And right here is where the guy asks him, what is your name? And he says, Jacob. Right? My name is Heel Grabber. I'm a deceiver. And this is what the guy says. I already read it, but let's read it again. Your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel. For you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. He says, Jacob, let me tell you something. You've been wrestling with me this entire night. And even though I've shown you I'm more powerful than you, you still won't let go. You won't stop until I bless you. Because you feel this urge to strive and swindle your way into every single thing. And you know what, Jacob? You win. You win. You're too stubborn. So your name is no longer just Heel Grabber. Your name is God Wrestler. Right? Israel means to strive with God, to wrestle with God. He says that's who you are. And it turns out that this whole event right here on this night, it was supposed to be a picture of Jacob's life in its entirety. Right? This is what Jacob's been doing. Right? God has been trying to bless Jacob. I mean, even before Jacob was born, God promised the older will serve the younger. Right? God was already on Jacob's side. Yet Jacob felt the need to deceive and swindle his way into every single thing. God was already going to give him these things. God was already going to bless him. Yet Jacob felt the need to wrestle. He felt the need to strive. He could have simply lived by faith and received it. But instead, he wanted to work for it. He wanted to wrestle with God. And God says, you know what? You win. You've prevailed. Good job, God wrestler. That's where you're going to be known as going forward. And so his name is changed to Israel. Right? And that's where we get the name Israel. And it's funny because that's actually the story of the people of Israel as well. When you look at their history, what do? They wrestle with God. Right? God is constantly reaching out to them. God is constantly giving things to them. But they won't back down. They won't bow. They won't submit. They keep fighting. They keep pushing back. And so he says, your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. Then Jacob asked him and said, please tell me your name. But he said, why is it that you ask me my name? And he blessed him there. So Jacob named the place Peniel, for he said, I have seen God face to face, yet my life has been preserved. So the man says, you don't need to ask me my name. You know my name. And so once the guy leaves, Jacob acknowledges, yeah, I know who this is. Peniel. Pan means face, El means God. He says, I just saw God. He said, I was wrestling with God. And this seems to be the moment that kind of wakes Jacob up, where he realizes what he's been doing. He has been wrestling with God. And so that's how that story ends. Right? That's where Jacob gets the name Israel. And as you keep reading through it, you get to chapter 33, and once again, Jacob deceives Esau all over again. Right? This whole story started with him taking the blessing from Esau, and now he interacts with Esau. Right? Finally, he goes down, and Esau and the 400 men show up, and it turns out that Esau wasn't trying to kill Jacob. Esau just seems like he got 400 people together to just come greet his brother. And they grasp each other, like they hug each other, and they see how each other are doing, and Esau seems to have totally forgiven Jacob. It could be that Esau is simply the most forgiving person in the world, or it could be that, like we seem to think his parents were expecting, he was so dumb that he forgot why he was mad. We don't know. But Esau seems to have moved on, and he says, brother, I'm so glad you're back home. In fact, why don't you come back home down with me to a place called Seir? That's where I'm living right now. And we see that Jacob, even though he's been confronted by God on what he's done, he still hasn't fully learned his lesson. And he says, you know, brother, I'll catch up with you. How about that? Right? I'll go meet y'all down there in a little bit. And Esau says, well, how about this? At the very least, let me leave my servants with you. And let my servants join you and come back down with you. And Jacob says, oh, no, I don't want to trouble you with that. I'll just meet you down there. And Esau says, okay, love you, brother. And Esau departs and goes down to Seir. And then Jacob just goes somewhere else. Right? So I feel kind of bad for Esau, because here he gave Jacob another chance, yet Jacob still deceives him. And it's probably because Jacob, I think the issue with Jacob is that he views everybody how he is himself. Right? He is cunning and crafty, and I think he kind of reads that onto everybody else. Right? He knows that he would not simply forgive somebody, and so he can't simply accept forgiveness. Right? He knows that he always has ulterior motives, and so I think he presumes that Esau has ulterior motives. I think that's what it is. I think he does the same thing to God. That's why he wrestles. Right? Surely God can't simply bless somebody. That's too good to be true. What is he getting out of it? Right? Jacob knows he doesn't do anything unless he gets something out of it. And so he has a tough time seeing why Esau or Yahweh would do the same thing. And so instead of going down to Seir, Jacob takes his family over to Shechem. Right? And Shechem is the place where we get to chapter 34. And once again, remember how we saw Rebekah in a foreign place with a foreign man and the whole Isaac story? Well, now we have Jacob's daughter, Dinah, in a foreign land. And just so you know, my whole thing is I want to get to the Jacob cycle today. So we're going to finish that, then we'll be done. So when we're in Shechem, here we get to read about Jacob's one daughter named Dinah. Right? We read about her earlier, right? She's one of Leah's daughters. And while they're in the land of Shechem, she goes to visit the people of Shechem. And while she's there, she encounters the prince of Shechem. And the prince of Shechem does the unthinkable. he violates her. And you would like to think that the guy who violates a woman would be the villain of the story, but unfortunately, he is going to be the victim of the story by the chapter's end. Because it turns out that after he did this with Dinah, which he should have never done, it seems like he has a change of heart and he actually genuinely loves her. And so he tries to make things right. And he goes and talks with Jacob and the family and he says, hey, I would actually like to marry Dinah and I would like to make things right with this whole situation. But Jacob's sons are furious. And Simeon and Levi in particular, right? The second and third born. Well, they hear this and they start hatching a plan. And they say, we'll let you marry Dinah, but we have this custom. Every male who belongs to us must be circumcised, which is technically true, right? I mean, according to the Abrahamic covenant, you have to be circumcised. And so what they're saying is not incorrect. But they, like, once again, it's kind of like Jacob, right? Another trend. Sons learning from their fathers, right? Remember back whenever Jacob was deceiving Isaac? He brought God into the deception? That's what Simeon and Levi are doing, right? Oh, we have this custom where Yahweh requires our men to be circumcised. But they're not actually worried about being faithful to Yahweh. They're trying to get the men weak. And so, not only Shechem, but all the men, like not only the prince, but all the men of Shechem agree to get circumcised so that they can intermarry with Jacob and his family. And so they do that. And then in the middle of the night, when all the men are still weak from being circumcised, because it's not a pleasant experience, especially as an adult, all the men are still weak. They're all still bedridden. In the middle of the night, Simeon and Levi get up and they go out throughout the town and they murder every single man. And Jacob is furious about this, right? Because what the prince of Shechem did was unspeakable, but what Simeon and Levi did was more unspeakable. Because those guys were at least trying to make things right, and now what Simeon and Levi have done have made Jacob a stench throughout the land, right? Remember what God said? You will be a blessing, right? To be a blessing is to be life-giving. Yes. What they have just done is take lives, right? And they've taken technically innocent lives, right? People who were trying to make things right. People who were willing to circumcise. I mean, circumcision is a big deal. They were willing to be circumcised for their sake. But they went and took their lives. That is very, very problematic. And so, whenever you go into Genesis 35, Jacob's name is officially changed to Israel. Right? Now Jacob has officially returned. He is officially living here. Just so you know, Shechem, where this whole thing happened, that's actually the very first city that Abraham himself went to whenever he arrived in the land of Israel. Right? And so, it kind of makes sense, right? So here, just like God made a covenant to Abraham in this region, well, so God is also going to officially make his covenant with Jacob right here. Verse 9. Well, actually, at the beginning of chapter 35, Jacob moves to Bethel, which is exactly where Abraham moved after he left Shechem. Right? So Abram, when he journeyed down, he went to Shechem, then to Bethel, and now Jacob does the same thing. He goes to Shechem and he lives there for a bit, and after his name becomes a stench in Shechem, he moves down to Bethel. And if you remember, why was it called Bethel?
The house of God.
Yeah, but what was the situation leading to its name?
Whenever Jacob had like a dream.
Yeah, it was the vision, right? He had the dream, and remember, it was at the end of that dream that he said, if God brings me back to this place, he will be my God. Well, now God has literally brought him back to the exact same place, and he's come back with way more than a stone as a pillow. And so we read this. Then God appeared to Jacob again when he came from Padan Aram, and he blessed him. And God said to him, your name is Jacob, but you shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel shall be your name. Thus he called his name Israel. God also said to him, I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall come from you, and kings shall come forth from you. The land which I gave to Abraham and Isaac I will give to you, and I will give the land to your descendants after you. Then God went up from him in the place where he had spoken with him. Jacob set up a pillar in the place where he had spoken with him, a pillar of stone, and he poured out a drink offering on it. He also poured oil on it. So Jacob named the place where God had spoken with him Bethel. Right? And so God shows up to Jacob twice at Bethel. Right? And it's here where he rearticulates the fact that Jacob's name will indeed be Israel. right? So he has come back a changed man, right? He left the heel grabber. He has returned the God wrestler. Whenever you get to the end of Genesis 35, we get to see the love of Jacob's life die. This is what we read, starting in verse 16. Then they journeyed from Bethel, and when there was still some distance to go to Ephrath, Rachel began to give birth, and she suffered severe labor. When she was in severe labor, the midwife said to her, "Do not fear, for now you have another son." Remember, after she had given birth to Joseph, she said, "I pray God will give me another son." She's having another son. It came about, as her soul was departing, for she died, that she named him Benoni, but his father called him Benjamin. So Rachel died and was buried on the way to Ephrath, that is, Bethlehem. Jacob set up a pillar over her grave, and that is the pillar of Rachel's grave to this day. Then Israel journeyed on and pitched his tent beyond the river toward Eder. So Rachel dies here, and with that, I think part of Jacob dies as well, right? To where Jacob going forward is going to be, to be fair, he's going to go through a lot of stuff after this, as we go into the Joseph story starting next week. But Rachel dies, and as she dies, she gives birth to this child. And in her dying breaths, she names the child Ben-Oni, which means son of my sorrow, right? No wonder, son of my sorrow, she's dying. But Jacob says, I don't like that name. And he changes the child's name to Benjamin, right? Son of my right hand. It seems like the idea is that since this is the last gift that Rachel has given him, he is going to keep this boy as his right-hand man, right? This is his little buddy, right? Always going to be at his right hand. And so he's going to be very, very protective of Benjamin. But his favorite child, as we're going to see, is Rachel's firstborn named Joseph. So Joseph is the firstborn of Rachel, and so that's his favorite kid. But Benjamin is the last gift Rachel ever gave him, so that's his right-hand man. And so Joseph and Benjamin are going to be the ones that are especially close to Jacob. And that's what I'm really saying about Jacob. He never gets over Rachel, right? So even in Rachel's death, he can't help but almost idolize his two children. And that's going to lead to a lot of heartache for the whole family. And you even saw this, I didn't mention this earlier, but whenever Jacob, so after the whole wrestling with God incident, whenever Jacob got his family together and they were heading down to actually go meet with Esau, he separated them into groups, right? And he put Bilhah and Zilhah with their kids in the front, and then he put Leah and her kids after that, and then he put Joseph with Rachel in the back. And the reason why, it kind of just emphasizes who Jacob loved the most, because to be fair, Jacob went in front of all of them, but the idea is that if Esau was in fact with an army, then he was, who would be the first person to get attacked? The ones in the front, right? And so he was more willing to let the children of the maidservants die, and then he was willing to let Leah's children die, but he wanted Rachel and Joseph to get away. Which I think is still so sad. To where you just see that Jacob, he is a transformed man. But even then, he's no Isaac, and he's certainly no Abraham. Right? And that's really the sad part. I really think a big part of the aspect of this, a big theme in Genesis is faith. And in Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, we get to see different types of faith. Right? Abraham is the faith that we should strive for. Isaac is the type of faith that is acceptable, but not really something we should strive for. And in Jacob, we see the type of faith that is honestly quite surprising. Because it's wow. You would not look at Jacob and think that he was a man of faith. You would not look at Jacob and think that he was the chosen seed of God. But he is. Right? And it showed, if God can work through Jacob, he can work through any of us, which is really cool. And so, in Genesis 35, Rachel struggles in childbirth and Benjamin is born, and then the Jacob cycle ends as it began, right? We started with the descendants of Ishmael, and we end with the descendants of Jacob, right? And if you actually go into the end of Genesis 35, you actually get a genealogy that just recaps who the sons of Israel are. And then Genesis 36 is actually just another genealogy detailing the descendants of Esau, right? And so that is where we are going to wrap up today, having looked through all of that and seen Jacob the trickster turn into Jacob the God wrestler. Next week, we are going to pick up, and Lord willing, we are going to finish the book of Genesis by talking about Joseph and his brothers and all the stuff that went down there. Sound good? There's a lot of stuff I wanted to cover today in the Jacob story that we just kind of had to skim over, but that's because I want to keep us on pace to, actually get this stuff done. But just recognize that you could go way more in depth on all of this stuff. We are just doing overview. Sound good?
Yes, sir.
All right. Dear Lord, thank you so much for allowing us to be here today. We praise you. We thank you for all that you have done, you are doing, and you will do. We thank you for your word, and we praise you for letting us go through it. To your name we pray. Amen.